Wyoming Territory, 1876, a land where fortune favored the bold and mercy was as scarce as rainfall. A time when a woman's beauty was her currency and her scars were debts she could never repay. A time when Emma Sullivan, with her fire-ravaged skin and quiet dignity, arrived at Pinecrest Station clutching a letter that held more hope than truth. She traveled over 1,000 miles on the promise of a new beginning, only to find her future disintegrating beneath the horrified gaze of a man who'd courted her with beautiful words, but couldn't bear the sight of her scarred face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, as Emma stood alone on the wooden platform, the weight of Harold Fletcher's rejection heavier than the trunk at her feet. His handwritten note, hastily scrawled after one look at her marked skin, fluttered in the evening breeze, a cruel testament to promises that died before they could bloom. "I regret that our arrangement must conclude," he'd written, not even granting her the dignity of hearing the words spoken aloud. "Your condition was not disclosed in our correspondence. My position in Pinecrest requires a wife of unblemished appearance. I've arranged your return passage east." The wind whispered through the pines surrounding Pinecrest Station, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Emma Sullivan pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the rough wool catching on the raised scars that traced her right hand and disappeared beneath her sleeve, permanent reminders of the night she'd pulled her younger brothers from their burning home. She'd saved them both, but the flames had claimed her smooth skin and any dreams of conventional beauty. Station Master Clyde Jenkins emerged from the tiny station house, his weathered face creased with concern as he approached. 3 hours had passed since Harold Fletcher had taken one look at her, blanched visibly, and retreated to his carriage without so much as a proper introduction. The station master had witnessed it all, his kind eyes reflecting pity she couldn't bear to acknowledge. "Last stage east doesn't come through till Tuesday, Miss Sullivan," he said, shifting awkwardly from one foot to another. "There's a room above the station you're welcome to use until then." Emma straightened her spine, years of facing pitying glances having forged a quiet strength within her. "Is there accommodation in town, Mr. Jenkins? I'd prefer not to impose." The station master's gaze flickered briefly to the scarring that traveled from her jawline down her neck before meeting her eyes again. To his credit, his expression remained unchanged. "Wilson boarding house is respectable. Clara Wilson's a good woman, fair-minded, doesn't tolerate gossip under her roof." "And the distance to town?" "Just over a mile. I'd offer you a ride, but my wagon's axle broke yesterday." He gestured vaguely toward town. "Follow the main road, can't miss it." Emma nodded her thanks, bending to gather her trunk. Jenkins stepped forward. "I can have one of the freight boys deliver that for you tomorrow, miss. No sense breaking your back." She relinquished the trunk with murmured gratitude and began the walk toward Pinecrest, her carpet bag clutched tightly in one hand, Harold Fletcher's rejection letter crushed in the other. The road stretched before her, rutted from recent rains, and dappled with the long shadows of late afternoon. In the distance, a cluster of buildings rose against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, some rough-hewn, others boasting painted facades and glass windows that reflected the fading sunlight. As she walked, Emma tried to organize her thoughts, to formulate some semblance of a plan from the wreckage of her expectations. At 26, she was well past the age when most women married. The fire that had scarred her 4 years ago had done more than mark her skin. It had narrowed her prospects to near invisibility, leaving her with few options in her small Ohio town. When Harold Fletcher's advertisement seeking a practical, educated wife of good character had appeared in the matrimonial news, Emma had responded with cautious hope. Their correspondence over 6 months had seemed promising. Fletcher, a lumber mill owner in Wyoming Territory, had written of his need for a partner with sensible expectations and a steady disposition. Emma had been candid about her age and education, her experience keeping books for her father's store before his passing, her skill with needlework and cooking. She had not, however, detailed her scarring, not to deceive, but because she'd thought such matters better discussed in person, where explanation could accompany revelation. A terrible miscalculation, as it turned out. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Emma from her thoughts. She moved to the side of the road as a rider approached from the direction of town, a broad-shouldered man astride a tall bay gelding. As he drew nearer, Emma kept her face turned slightly away, a habitual gesture to present her unmarked left profile to strangers. The rider slowed as he reached her, and she risked a glance upward. The man wore a dark hat pulled low, but she could make out a strong jawline shadowed with several days' growth of beard. A badge gleamed on his chest, a Marshal's star catching the last rays of sunlight. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and measured. "You're a ways from town this late in the day." "I'm on my way to the Wilson boarding house," Emma replied, still presenting her better side. The Marshal studied her for a moment. There was something assessing in his gaze, but none of the revulsion she'd come to expect when people noticed her scars. "That's a fair walk with night coming on," he said finally. "Would you care for a ride? Ajax here is a gentle mount." Emma hesitated. In the failing light, with the road stretching empty before her, prudence suggested accepting the offer. "Thank you, Marshal," she said after a moment. "That's very kind." He dismounted with practiced ease, though Emma noticed a slight stiffness in his movements. Up close, she could see that the left side of his face bore its own story, a long scar that ran from temple to jaw, partially hidden by his beard. His eyes, a deep grey like storm clouds, held no pity when they met hers, just a simple recognition. "Robert Caldwell," he said, extending a hand. "Most folks call me Marshal Rob." "Emma Sullivan." She shook his hand briefly, surprised by the calluses that spoke of work beyond wearing a badge. He helped her mount, his movements efficient rather, then gallant, then swung back into the saddle behind her, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring she was secure. The horse moved forward at a gentle pace, the Marshal's arms on either side of her to hold the reins. "First time in Pinecrest?" he asked as they rode. "Yes," she answered, then added with a touch of bitterness she couldn't quite suppress, "though I don't expect to be staying long." "Most don't," he replied evenly. "Territory life isn't for everyone." Emma said nothing, unwilling to explain her circumstances to a stranger, even one who had shown kindness. As they crested a small rise, the town of Pinecrest came into full view, a main street lined with establishments both prosperous and precarious, side streets branching off with smaller dwellings, and at the far end, the imposing structure of what could only be Fletcher's lumber mill. "That's Wilson's place," Marshal Caldwell said, nodding toward a two-story building set slightly back from the main thoroughfare. It was painted a faded blue with white trim, a small sign hanging near the entrance. "Best accommodations in Pinecrest," though that's not saying much. As they approached the boarding house, Emma felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded meeting new people. The inevitable stares, the poorly disguised shock, the awkward questions, or worse, the awkward silences. She had endured them all before, and would again. The Marshal dismounted first, then offered a hand to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, the front door of the boarding house opened, casting a rectangle of warm light onto the porch. A woman stood framed in the doorway, tall and straight-backed, with silver-threaded dark hair pulled into a practical knot. "Evening, Marshal," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Bringing me strays again?" "Evening, Clara," he replied, a hint of familiarity in his tone. "Miss Sullivan here is looking for lodging." Clara Wilson stepped fully onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron as she assessed Emma with alert brown eyes. Unlike most, her gaze didn't linger on Emma's scars, instead meeting her eyes directly. "Well, come in then," she said briskly. "Supper's nearly on, and there's hot water for washing up if you've a mind to." The Marshal handed Emma her carpet bag. "Miss Sullivan's trunk is at the station," he explained. "Jenkins will send it along tomorrow." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm obliged to you, Marshal," Emma said, meaning it. The walk would have been difficult in the gathering darkness. He tipped his hat slightly. "Welcome to Pinecrest, Miss Sullivan. Mrs. Wilson will see you settled." With a nod to Clara, he remounted and continued down the street toward what Emma presumed was the Marshal's office. Clara Wilson ushered Emma inside with minimal fuss, showing her to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," she explained. "Meals are included. Breakfast from 6 to 8, supper at 6 sharp. No midday meal except Sundays." The room was simply furnished. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small writing desk, and a chest of drawers. A window overlooked the main street, and Emma could see the Marshal's retreating figure in the last light of dusk. "What brings you to Pinecrest?" Clara asked, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. The question was direct, but not intrusive, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than prying. Emma hesitated. "I had an arrangement that didn't come to fruition." Clara's expression flickered with understanding. "Fletcher," she said, not a question but a statement. Emma's surprise must have shown on her face, for Clara shook her head slightly. "Small towns have few secrets, Miss Sullivan. Harold Fletcher's search for a mail-order bride has been common knowledge for months. His carriage returned from the station without you, and here you are, seeking lodging." A flush of embarrassment warmed Emma's cheeks. "I see." "Don't fret," Clara said, her voice gentler. "Fletcher's a fool, and not the first man to let his eyes override his sense. How long will you be staying?" "Until Tuesday, when the eastbound stage comes through." Emma reached for her purse. "I can pay for 3 nights." Clara considered her for a moment. 3 nights, then, though I wonder. Yes, Pinecrest's in need of a school teacher. Last one left when her father took ill back east. Mayor's been advertising, but qualified women willing to come. The Wyoming Territory aren't exactly plentiful. Emma stared at her, caught off guard by the suggestion. I have some experience teaching, but I wasn't planning to stay." "Of course," Clara said smoothly. "Just an observation. Rest now. Supper in half an hour if you're hungry." After Clara left, Emma sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. She'd arrived full of cautious hope, only to be rejected within moments. Now, mere hours later, a seed of possibility had been planted, one she hadn't considered and wasn't sure she should contemplate. The idea of remaining in Pinecrest, of facing Harold Fletcher regularly in such a small community, seemed impossible. And yet the prospect of returning east to the pitying glances and limited opportunities that awaited her there held little appeal. Emma moved to the washstand, pouring water into the basin and washing her face and hands carefully. The cool water soothed her travel-weary skin. She unpinned her hair, letting the auburn waves fall around her shoulders, providing some cover for the scarring that extended down her neck. In the small mirror above the washstand, she studied her reflection critically. The right side of her face bore the unmistakable marks of fire, skin puckered and discolored, extending from temple to jawline. Her right eyebrow was partially missing, giving her a perpetually questioning expression. The left side, untouched by flames, retained the features that had once made her consider herself, if not beautiful, at least pleasant to look upon. clear. Hazel eyes, high cheekbones, a mouth that curved easily into a smile before the fire. She had long since stopped wondering what her life might have been without the scars. They had saved her brothers. That knowledge was enough to make peace with her reflection. It was other people's reactions that proved more difficult to accept. The lynching, the averted gazes, the children's blunt questions. Harold Fletcher's rejection was merely the latest in a series of reminders that her appearance marked her as separate, other. The boarding house bell rang, signaling supper. Emma rebraided her hair quickly, letting it fall forward over her right shoulder to partially obscure her scarred cheek. With a deep breath, she prepared to face the other boarders and whatever reactions would follow. The dining room proved mercifully small, with only one large table currently occupied by 3 people besides Clara Wilson. An elderly woman with bright, alert eyes and snow-white hair, a middle-aged man in a black suit that marked him as a clergyman, and a younger man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "Miss Sullivan will be joining us for a few days," Clara announced as Emma entered. "Miss Sullivan, meet Mrs. Winters, Pastor Bennett, and Mr. Langley, who writes for our local newspaper such as it is." Emma nodded politely as she took the empty seat beside Mrs. Winters. "Good evening. From back east, are you?" Mrs. Winters asked immediately, her voice surprisingly strong for her apparent age. "Illinois, Ohio." "Ohio," Emma confirmed, serving herself from the platter of roast beef that Clara passed around. "Thought so. You have that solid Midwestern look about you, not like these flighty California girls who can't handle a proper winter." Mrs. Winters nodded decisively, as though Emma's state of origin settled some long-standing debate. Pastor Bennett smiled kindly. "Welcome to Pinecrest, Miss Sullivan. I hope you'll join us for Sunday services if you're still in town." "She's leaving Tuesday," Clara informed them, passing a bowl of potatoes to Emma, "unless she changes her mind about our teaching vacancy." The pastor's eyebrows rose with interest. "You're a teacher?" "I taught at a small school in Ohio for 2 years, Emma admitted, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "But I haven't 2 years. That's more experience than anyone else who's applied," Mr. Langley interjected. "Which amounts to precisely no one since we placed the advertisement." "I haven't decided to stay," Emma clarified, feeling the conversation slipping beyond her control. Mrs. Winters patted her hand. "Of course you haven't, dear. But you should know the children here are running wild. Deputy Marshal's boys started a fire behind the mercantile last week. Experimentation, they called it. What those children need is proper schooling, not this haphazard arrangement where Mayor Thompson's wife teaches when she feels like it." Emma focused on her plate, acutely, aware of the curious glances from Mr. Langley, who had finally noticed her scars. His gaze kept returning to the right side of her face, though he was clearly trying to be discreet. "The position includes housing," Pastor Bennett added. "The schoolmaster's cottage is small but comfortable, and the salary, while not lavish, is stable." "I appreciate the information," Emma said carefully, "but as I've only just arrived, I'm not prepared to make any decisions about staying." Clara efficiently redirected the conversation to local matters, the progress of the new church steeple, the recent arrest of a cattle rustler, the unusually dry spring. Emma ate quietly, grateful for the respite from scrutiny, though she noticed Mr. Langley continued to steal glances in her direction. After supper, Emma excused herself to her room, citing fatigue from travel. Once alone, she sat at the small desk and withdrew her writing materials from her carpet bag. She needed to inform her brothers of the change in plans, to let them know she would be returning east rather than establishing a home in Wyoming as intended. The letter proved difficult to compose. How to explain her rejection without causing alarm or anger, William and David had opposed her plan to become a mail-order bride, arguing that she deserved better than a marriage based on practicality rather than affection. Now it seemed even practicality had its limits when faced with her scarred appearance. A knock at her door interrupted her struggling efforts. Emma opened it to find Clara Wilson holding a steaming cup. "Chamomile tea," Clara explained, offering the cup. "Good for settling the nerves after a trying day." "Thank you." Emma accepted the tea, touched by the thoughtful gesture. Clara lingered in the doorway. "I hope the discussion at supper didn't overwhelm you. Folks here can be forward, especially when they're desperate for a school teacher." "It's fine," Emma assured her, "though I'm not certain I'd be what the town has in mind." Clara's expression sharpened. "Because of the scars." The directness of the question startled Emma. Most people avoided any mention of her appearance, as though speaking of it might somehow be contagious. "Partly," she admitted after a moment. "Parents can be particular about who teaches their children." "Some might be," Clara agreed. "Others might see the value in having someone who's faced adversity teaching their young ones about perseverance. Not all lessons come from books, Miss Sullivan." Emma sipped her tea, considering Clara's words. "Mr. Fletcher seemed to think my appearance would be problematic for his position in the community." "Harold Fletcher," Clara said with undisguised scorn, "is more concerned with appearances than substance. Always has been, even as a boy. His lumber mill may be the largest business in town, but that doesn't make him the authority on who belongs here." Emma smiled faintly. "Nevertheless, it would be awkward to remain in a town where my first introduction was such a public rejection." "No, perhaps," Clara conceded. "Or perhaps showing Fletcher that his rejection didn't defeat you would be satisfying in its own right." She straightened, moving back from the doorway. "Something to consider, at any rate. Rest well, Miss Sullivan." After Clara departed, Emma returned to her letter, but her thoughts kept circling back to the conversation. The teaching position offered a potential path forward she hadn't considered. Even if she stayed only until a permanent replacement could be found, it would allow her time to rebuild her savings, depleted by the journey west. It would also mean facing Harold Fletcher regularly in the small community, enduring his discomfort, and the inevitable gossip about their aborted arrangement. The thought made her stomach clench with embarrassment and dread. And yet, the alternative, returning cast with her hopes dashed, admitting to her brothers that they had been right, held its own sting. Emma set aside her writing materials, the letter unfinished. Tomorrow would be time enough to decide. For now, fatigue pulled at her, the long journey and emotional toll of the day catching up all at once. She prepared for bed, grateful for the clean linens and quiet room, a vast improvement over the jolting train compartments and crowded way stations of the past week. As she drifted towards sleep, her thoughts returned unexpectedly to Marshal Robert Caldwell, with his storm-grey eyes and the scar that marked his own face. Unlike so many, he had looked directly at her, neither flinching from her scars nor pretending not to notice them. There had been a simple recognition in his gaze of what she wasn't certain, but it had lacked the pity she so despised. It was this memory, rather than Harold Fletcher's rejection, that followed Emma into dreams, the image of a man who seemed to understand that scars told stories worth hearing, not secrets to be hidden away in shame. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of Emma's room. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she forgot the events of the previous day. Then reality reasserted itself. She was in Pinecrest, Wyoming Territory, rejected by her prospective husband, with 3 days to determine her next course of action. She rose and dressed efficiently, choosing a high-necked blue dress that covered most of her scarring. Her trunk would arrive later, but for now, her limited traveling wardrobe would have to suffice. She braided her hair in her usual style, allowing it to fall forward and partially shield her scarred cheek, then made her way downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was empty save for Clara, who was setting out platters of eggs, bacon, and freshly baked biscuits. "You're an early riser," she observed as Emma entered. "Help yourself. Coffee's hot." Emma filled a plate, hungry despite the lingering uncertainty about her situation. "Will your other boarders be joining us?" "Pastor's already eaten and gone to attend to a family on the north edge of town. Mrs. Winters never emerges before 9, claims old bones need extra rest. And Mr. Langley takes breakfast at the Silver Star Saloon. Says he gets better gossip for his newspaper there." Clara poured coffee for them both and sat across from Emma. "Any clearer thoughts this morning about your plans?" Emma buttered her biscuit carefully. "I'm still considering my options, including the teaching position, perhaps, though I'd need to know more about what it entails." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Mayor Thompson handles school matters. His office is next to the general store. I'd be happy to introduce you if you're interested." The offer was made casually, but Emma sensed genuine support behind it. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to waste the mayor's time if I'm not certain of staying." "An introduction isn't a commitment," Clara pointed out reasonably, "and George Thompson is a fair man. He could answer your questions without pressure." Emma hesitated, weighing her options. A conversation with the mayor would provide valuable information, and as Clara said, it didn't obligate her to accept any position. "Very well," she agreed finally. "An introduction would be helpful." Clara appeared pleased with this concession. "Excellent. We can stop by his office after breakfast, and perhaps I can show you around town a bit, help you get your bearings." The tour, as it turned out, was more illuminating than Emma had expected. Pinecrest, while small, was clearly a town on the cusp of transition, raw frontier giving way to more established civilization. The main street boasted several substantial buildings: the general store, a bank, the Silver Star Saloon, a small hotel, and various shops. Side streets held more modest dwellings, some little more than cabins, others showing signs of expansion and improvement. At the north end of town stood the church, its steeple indeed under construction as mentioned at dinner, and beside it, set back among a grove of pines, the schoolhouse, a simple but well-maintained structure with large windows to capture natural light. Adjacent to it was a small cottage that Emma presumed was the teacher's residence Clara had mentioned. "We have about 30 children of school age," Clara explained as they paused to look at the schoolhouse. "From 6 to 16, though most boys leave schooling by 14 to work. Mayor Thompson's daughter Lily is 10. Bright girl, asks more questions than most adults care to answer." Emma found herself drawn to the schoolhouse despite her reservations. Teaching had been one of the few positions open to her after the fire, her scars less important than her knowledge and ability to maintain order among lively children. She had enjoyed the work in Ohio, leaving only when her brothers had needed her help after William's wife fell ill. "Is it locked?" she asked, gesturing toward the schoolhouse. "I'd be curious to see inside." Clara's smile suggested she found Emma's interest promising. "The mayor keeps a key. We can ask when we see him." Their tour continued, with Clara pointing out various landmarks and introducing Emma to townspeople they encountered. The reactions to Emma's scarring were varied but predictable. Polite nods followed by quickly averted eyes, curious stares from children promptly shushed by parents, and occasionally the refreshing directness of frontier forthrightness. "Fire get you?" asked the blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Anders Jensen, after Clara introduced them. When Emma nodded, he simply said, "Got my brother too. Foundry accident. Tougher than he looks now, though." There was a simple respect in his manner that Emma found unexpectedly comforting. As they approached the mayor's office, Emma spotted a familiar figure emerging from the building next door, which bore the sign Marshal's office over its entrance. Robert Caldwell nodded in greeting as he noticed them. "Mrs. Wilson," he acknowledged, then turned to Emma. "Miss Sullivan, settled?" "In well? Yes, thank you, Marshal," Emma replied. "Mrs. Wilson has been very kind." "Clara's kindness is selective," he said, the hint of a smile softening his serious expression. "Means she sees something worthwhile." Clara snorted lightly at this assessment. "Don't let him fool you, Miss Sullivan. Beneath that stern facade, the Marshal's as soft-hearted as they come. Took in that scrawny stray cat last winter. Now it practically runs his office." A flash of genuine humor crossed the Marshal's face, transforming it briefly. "Mouse keeps the jail cells free of vermin. She's earning her keep." "We're on our way to see Mayor Thompson," Clara explained. "Miss Sullivan's considering our teaching vacancy." The Marshal's gaze returned to Emma, assessing but not intrusive. "Town needs a proper teacher. Mayor's wife does her best, but she's stretched thin with her other duties." Emma found herself needing to clarify her position. "I haven't decided anything yet. I'm merely gathering information." He nodded, seemingly understanding the caution behind her words. "Information's always valuable. Mayor should be in sore. Him arrive earlier." He touched the brim of his hat in a brief gesture of farewell. "Ladies." As he moved past them toward the main street, Emma noticed again the slight stiffness in his gait, particularly on his left side. Clara, following. Her gaze offered explanation without prompting. "War injury," she said quietly. "Antietam. Nearly lost the leg. Still gives him trouble when the weather changes. He seems very capable despite it," Emma observed. "Marshal Caldwell's the most capable man in Pinecrest," Clara stated with conviction. "Town was lawless before he took the badge 3 years ago. Now even the roughest miners think twice before causing trouble." They continued to the mayor's office, a modest but official-looking building with Town Hall painted above the door. Inside, a small anteroom led to an inner office where Mayor George Thompson sat behind a desk covered with papers and ledgers. He was a man of medium height and build, with a neatly trimmed beard showing early threads of silver and intelligent eyes that looked up sharply when Clara knocked on his open door. "Clara!" he greeted her warmly, rising from his seat. "What brings you by this morning?" "George, this is Miss Emma Sullivan, recently arrived from Ohio. She's staying at the boarding house temporarily and has experience as a teacher. I thought you might want to discuss our vacancy with her." The mayor's eyebrows rose with interest as he extended a hand to Emma. "Miss Sullivan, a pleasure. Please, both of you, sit." As they settled into chairs across from his desk, Emma noticed the mayor's gaze taking in her scarring with a quick assessing glance before returning to her eyes. To his credit, his expression remained unchanged. "We've been without a dedicated teacher since Miss Harrington returned east 2 months ago," he explained. "My wife has been filling in, but with her duties as the doctor's assistant and caring for our household, it's far from ideal. The children's education is suffering." "I taught for 2 years in a small school near Columbus," Emma said. "Children from 6 to 15, similar to what Mrs. Wilson described for Pinecrest." "Any formal training?" "A year at the normal school in Columbus, and my father was a professor before his health failed. He continued my education at home." The mayor nodded thoughtfully. "And what brings you to Pinecrest, if I may ask?" Emma hesitated, uncertain how much the mayor already knew about her aborted arrangement with Harold Fletcher. Clara answered for her. Emma chose her words carefully, unwilling to have her story told by others. "I came to Pinecrest with certain expectations that didn't materialize. I'm now considering alternatives before deciding whether to return east." Mayor Thompson nodded, his expression suggesting he understood more than she'd explicitly stated. "Well, Miss Sullivan, our situation is straightforward. We need a teacher, someone with proper training who can provide our children with education beyond basic arithmetic and reading. The position includes the cottage beside the schoolhouse, a monthly salary of $40, and the respect accorded to educators in our community." The offer was generous by any standard, particularly the housing. Emma found herself genuinely tempted despite her reservations about remaining in Pinecrest. "You mentioned your wife has been teaching," she said. "Would she be disappointed if someone else took over?" The mayor chuckled. "Elizabeth would be delighted. She's a trained nurse who only teaches out of necessity. With our doctor increasingly overwhelmed as the town grows, her medical skills are needed more than her teaching abilities." "And the school board? Would they need to approve any appointment?" "The board consists of myself, Pastor Bennett, and Mr. Simmons from the bank. Pastor, you've met, and Walter Simmons generally defers to my judgment on school matters. His interest lies primarily in ensuring the budget remains balanced." The mayor leaned forward slightly. "I won't pretend there wouldn't be challenges. Miss Sullivan, some parents might initially have concerns." Emma appreciated his delicate approach to what they both knew would be reactions to her appearance. "I'm accustomed to such concerns, Mayor Thompson. They generally subside when people see that scars don't affect one's ability to teach multiplication tables." A smile of genuine approval crossed his face. "Precisely my thinking. Would you like to see the schoolhouse? I keep a key here." Emma glanced at Clara, who gave an encouraging nod. "Yes, I would, thank you." The schoolhouse, when they reached it, proved to be a pleasant surprise. Though simple in design, one large room with rows of desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard, it was well constructed, with large windows allowing ample light and a pot-bellied stove that would provide adequate heat in winter. Bookshelves lined the back wall, modestly stocked but containing the essentials for basic education. The previous teacher left her curriculum notes, Mayor Thompson explained, retrieving a leather-bound book from a drawer in the teacher's desk. Daily schedules, lesson progressions for different age groups, that sort of thing. Emma leafed through the book, noting the orderly handwriting and thoughtful organization. Miss Harrington was thorough. "She was an excellent teacher," the mayor confirmed. "We were sorry to lose her, but family obligations called her home. Would you like to see the cottage as well?" The teacher's cottage was even more appealing than the schoolhouse. A snug dwelling with a small parlor, kitchen, bedroom and study. Simple furniture filled the rooms, worn but serviceable, and bright quilts added touches of color. The windows offered views of the pine forest behind and the schoolyard in front. "It's lovely," Emma said honestly, surprised by how much the little house appealed to her. After years of living in her brother's home, the prospect of a space entirely her own held considerable charm. "It comes with the position," Mayor Thompson reminded her. "Fully furnished, though you're welcome to make any changes you'd like if you accept." The "if" hung in the air between them. Emma realized she was genuinely considering the possibility now, not merely gathering information. The practical advantages were undeniable: immediate housing, steady income, and meaningful work. The social complications remained significant, but perhaps not insurmountable. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "This is a substantial decision." "Of course," the mayor agreed readily. "The position has been vacant for 2 months. Another few days won't make a difference. Though I should mention..." He hesitated slightly. "Yes?" "The spring social is Saturday evening at the church hall. Most of the town attends. It would be an opportunity for you to meet families with school-age children, get a better sense of the community before deciding." Emma's instinctive reaction was reluctance. Social gatherings meant prolonged exposure to curious stares and awkward questions. Yet she recognized the practical value of the mayor's suggestion. If she were to teach these children, meeting their parents beforehand made sense. "I'll consider attending," she said, non-committal but not refusing outright. As they left the cottage, a young girl came racing around the corner of the schoolhouse, nearly colliding with them. She skidded to a halt, her dark braids swinging with the sudden stop, and looked up with curious eyes. "Papa! I've been looking everywhere for you. Mrs. Winters says you promised to fix her porch step today, and she's telling everyone at the general store that you're—" The girl broke off, suddenly noticing Emma. Her gaze went immediately to the scarring. But unlike most children, she didn't look away. Instead, her expression shifted to open interest. "Lily," the mayor said with the patient tone of a father accustomed to his daughter's exuberance, "this is Miss Sullivan. She's considering becoming our new teacher." Lily's eyes widened. "Really? Do you know about dinosaur bones?" Miss Harrington said they found gigantic lizard skeletons out west, but she didn't know much about them. Caught off guard by the unexpected question, Emma smiled. "I've read about the recent discoveries. Professor Marsh's expeditions have found remarkable specimens." "You know about them?" Lily exclaimed, clearly delighted. "Tommy Fletcher said they weren't real, that scientists made them up to confuse people. I told him that was stupid, but he just pulled my braid and ran away." "Lily," her father admonished gently, "we've discussed appropriate language." "Sorry, Papa." The girl didn't look particularly repentant. She turned back to Emma. "Were you in a fire? Billy Cross's pa has burns all down his arm from when the saloon burned 2 years ago. He says they don't hurt anymore, but they look scary." "Lily!" "Could I?" This time the mayor's tone held genuine mortification. "That's not an appropriate question." Emma, however, found the girl's directness refreshing after so many averted eyes and unasked questions. "Yes, I was in a fire 4 years ago. You're right that they don't hurt anymore, though they did at first." Lily nodded, accepting this information with matter-of-fact interest. "If you become our teacher, will you tell us about the dinosaur bones sometimes? And maybe about the fire too, if it's not too sad to talk about?" There was something so earnest in the girl's curiosity, so free of judgment, that Emma felt a surprising surge of warmth toward her. "I might, if it relates to our lessons." This seemed to satisfy Lily. She turned back to her father. "Are you coming to fix Mrs. Winters' step? She's getting very impatient." The mayor sighed. "I'll be along shortly. Run and tell her I haven't forgotten." As Lily darted away, he turned to Emma with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry about that. Lily's questions tend to outpace her sense of propriety." "No apology needed," Emma assured him. "Her curiosity is natural, and I've always found children's directness easier to manage than adults' discomfort." They walked back toward town, Clara joining them after having waited tactfully outside during their tour of the cottage. As they approached the main street, Emma spotted a familiar tall figure in conversation with another man outside the Marshal's office. Marshal Caldwell and the other man, expensively dressed with a neatly trimmed beard, appeared to be in the midst of a tense discussion. As they drew nearer, the well-dressed man's voice became audible, his tone containing barely restrained irritation. "Completely unnecessary, Marshal. A simple misunderstanding that's been addressed." 3 complaints in 2 weeks isn't a misunderstanding, Fletcher. It's a pattern. Marshal Caldwell's response was measured but firm. "Your men can't keep intimidating homesteaders because they happen to settle near your timber claims." Emma faltered slightly at the name. This, then, was Harold Fletcher, the man whose letter she still carried, whose rejection had upended her plans. He looked much as she had imagined from his correspondence, prosperous, well-groomed, authoritative, the kind of man accustomed, to having his way. Clara noticed her hesitation and murmured quietly, "We can take another route if you prefer." Before Emma could respond, Mayor Thompson, who hadn't registered her discomfort, called out a greeting. "Robert, Harold, good morning." Both men turned. Marshal Caldwell nodded in acknowledgement, while Fletcher's expression shifted to one of practiced cordiality. Then his gaze fell on Emma, and the polite mask slipped momentarily, revealing recognition followed by distinct discomfort. "George," Fletcher responded after a moment's hesitation, his eyes sliding away from Emma. "Mrs. Wilson." "Harold," Clara returned coolly. Mayor Thompson, now sensing the tension, attempted to smooth it over. "I've just been showing Miss Sullivan our schoolhouse. She's considering taking the teaching position." Fletcher's discomfort visibly increased. "Indeed. How pragmatic of you, Mayor, to find a candidate so quickly." The condescension in his tone wasn't lost on anyone present. Marshal Caldwell's expression hardened slightly as he studied Fletcher, then Emma clearly. Perceiving the undercurrents of the interaction, "Miss Sullivan has experience teaching in Ohio," the mayor continued, either missing or choosing to ignore Fletcher's tone, "and excellent references." "I'm sure," Fletcher said, his gaze finally meeting Emma's directly, "though I wonder if Pinecrest's particular requirements were made clear." Emma felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from a sudden surge of anger at his transparent attempt to undermine her. Before she could formulate a suitably cutting response, Marshal Caldwell spoke. "The requirements for teaching are education, patience, and character," he said, his voice level but containing an edge of steel. "Miss Sullivan strikes me as possessing all three." Fletcher's mouth tightened, clearly displeased at being contradicted. "You'll forgive me if I question whether a town marshal is the authority on educational standards, Caldwell. And you'll forgive me if I question whether a lumber mill owner is?" Clara interjected tartly. The mayor, visibly uncomfortable with the escalating tension, attempted to redirect the conversation. "Harold, we've scheduled the town council meeting for Monday evening. I trust you'll attend. We need to discuss the road improvements." Fletcher maintained his rigid posture for a moment longer before offering a curt nod. "Of course. If you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." Wade, with a final glance at Emma, a mixture of discomfort and something else she couldn't quite identify, he walked away toward the imposing building at the far end of the street that housed his lumber operation. "Well," Clara said into the awkward silence that followed, "that was precisely as pleasant as I expected." Marshal Caldwell turned to Emma, his expression suggesting he'd pieced together the situation. "Fletcher was your arrangement that didn't materialize." It wasn't a question, but Emma nodded anyway, seeing no point in denials. "We corresponded for several months. He found the reality disappointing. The reality being your scars," the marshal clarified, his directness matching Lily's, but with adult understanding of the implications. "Yes." Mayor Thompson looked between them with growing comprehension. "I see. I apologize, Miss Sullivan. Had I known the specific nature of your prior connection to Harold, I might have handled that encounter differently." "There's no need for apologies, Mayor," Emma said firmly. "Mr. Fletcher made his position clear yesterday. I've accepted it and am moving forward with alternative considerations." Marshal Caldwell studied her thoughtfully. "Including teaching. Pinecrest's children, potentially including Fletcher's nephew." This was information Emma hadn't considered. "Tommy Fletcher, the boy Lily mentioned?" "Harold's brother's son," the mayor confirmed. "Lives with Harold since his parents passed in a fever outbreak 2 years ago. Difficult child, though not without reason, given the circumstances." The situation grew more complicated with each new piece of information. Teaching in Pinecrest would mean not only encountering Harold Fletcher regularly, but also having responsibility for his nephew's education, a nephew who, according to Lily, already had a tendency toward dismissiveness and mild bullying. "I should return to my office," Mayor Thompson said after a moment. "Miss Sullivan, please let me know your decision about the position when you're ready, and do consider attending the spring social. It would be an excellent opportunity for introductions." After the mayor departed, Emma found herself standing, with Clara and Marshal Caldwell in a moment of shared awareness of the complexities surrounding her potential decision to remain in Pinecrest. "Fletcher's influence in town is substantial but not unlimited," the Marshal said finally. "His opinion doesn't dictate what the rest of the community thinks." "And what does the community think, Marshal?" Emma asked, genuinely curious about his assessment that we need a qualified teacher more than we need to cater to Harold Fletcher's sensibilities, he replied without hesitation. "Most folks here are practical above all else. Results matter more than appearances." Something in his phrasing caught Emma's attention, the slight emphasis on appearances that suggested he might be speaking from personal experience. The scar that marked his own face was evidence enough that he understood something of what she faced, though a man's battle scar and a woman's disfigurement carried very different social weights. "Would you be attending this spring social, Marshal?" Clara asked with what Emma suspected was deliberate casualness. "Hadn't planned to," he replied, a hint of wariness entering his expression. "Security matters generally keep me occupied. Surely the town can survive one evening without your constant vigilance," Clara pressed, "especially as your deputy will be present with his family." The Marshal's eyes narrowed slightly at her transparent maneuvering. "What exactly are you suggesting, Clara?" "Merely that Miss Sullivan might appreciate a friendly face among the crowd should she decide to attend." Clara's innocent tone fooled no one. Someone who won't gawk or ask impertinent questions. Emma felt compelled to intervene before the conversation ventured further into matchmaking territory, which was clearly Clara's intent. "I'm perfectly capable of attending on my own if I choose to go at all. Marshal Caldwell needn't rearrange his duties on my account." The Marshal's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I appreciate your defense of my professional responsibilities, Miss Sullivan." He paused, then added more seriously, "Though Clara's not entirely wrong. A newcomer's first social gathering can be challenging, especially in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business." Before Emma could respond, a shout from down the street captured their attention. A young boy came running toward them, his face flushed with urgency. "Marshal! Come quick! Johnson and McKenna are fighting at the Silver Star, and Mr. Adams says there's a gun involved." The Marshal's demeanor shifted instantly from conversational to alert. "Excuse me, ladies." With a brief nod, he strode toward the saloon, his hand moving to rest on the revolver at his hip. Clara sighed as they watched him go. "That man needs a deputy who can handle more than paperwork. He takes on too much himself." "He seems very capable," Emma observed. "Capable, yes, but he pushes that injured leg beyond what's wise, especially in confrontations." Clara shook her head. "Come, let's continue our tour. You should see the rest of Pinecrest before making any decisions." The remainder of the morning passed in further exploration of the town. Clara introduced Emma to various merchants and residents, each interaction providing additional insight into the community she was considering joining. The reactions to her scarring remained mixed, but tended more toward frontier practicality than outright rejection, a refreshing change from her experiences in more civilized settings. By the time they returned to the boarding house for the midday meal, served on Sundays only, as Clara had mentioned, Emma's mind was whirling with possibilities and concerns. The teaching position offered far more advantages than she had initially considered, yet the complications of Harold Fletcher's presence in town created undeniable obstacles. "You're quiet. Clara observed as they sat down to a simple lunch of cold chicken, bread, and preserves. Mrs. Winters had already eaten and retired for her customary afternoon rest, leaving them alone in the dining room. "I'm weighing options," Emma admitted. "The teaching position is appealing in many ways, but remaining in Pinecrest would mean regular encounters with Mr. Fletcher, not to mention teaching his nephew, who doesn't sound particularly receptive to education." Clara spread preserves on a slice of bread with methodical precision. "If you allowed Harold Fletcher's preferences to dictate your decisions, you'd be granting him power he hasn't earned and doesn't deserve. As for young Tommy, children often reflect the attitudes of the adults around them. A good teacher can make remarkable differences." "You seem very invested in my staying," Emma noted, curiosity prompting the observation. Clara considered this, then nodded slowly. "I suppose I am. Partly because the town genuinely needs a teacher, and you're clearly qualified, but also because I've seen too many people allow others to define their worth based on superficial judgments. It strikes me as wasteful." The simple honesty of this assessment resonated with Emma. She had indeed allowed others' reactions to her scarring to constrain her choices, to make her smaller and less visible. The journey west had been partly an attempt to escape those limitations, to build something new in a place where her history wasn't written on every interaction. That Harold Fletcher had immediately imposed the same limitations was bitter irony. That she might choose to stay anyway, to claim a place and purpose despite his judgment, there was a certain appeal to that defiance. "I'll attend the spring social," she decided aloud. "It seems the sensible thing to do before making any final decisions." Clara's smile suggested she'd expected this outcome. "Excellent. I have a dress that might suit you. Deep green, high-necked, but not severely so. We're of a height, though you're slimmer. Nothing a few pins couldn't adjust for a single evening." Emma hadn't considered the matter of appropriate attire. Her traveling clothes were serviceable but plain, and while her trunk contained her better garments, none was truly suitable for a social occasion. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense! The dress has been hanging unused since my niece's visit last fall. Consider it my contribution to Pinecrest's educational future." Clara's tone made it clear the matter was settled. After lunch, Emma returned to her room to continue the letter to her brothers she'd begun the previous evening. With her decision to at least delay her return east until after the spring social, she could now write with more certainty about her immediate plans, if not her long-term ones. She had just finished sealing the envelope when a knock at her door announced Clara, bearing what must be the promised green dress. It was indeed lovely, a rich emerald shade that complemented Emma's auburn hair with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. "Try it on," Clara urged. "We should see what adjustments are needed." The dress fit reasonably well through the shoulders and waist, though as Clara had predicted, it required pinning along the sides. The high neckline concealed most of the scarring that extended down Emma's throat, while the long sleeves covered the marks on her right arm. "Perfect," Clara pronounced, stepping back to assess the effect. "The color brings out your eyes beautifully." Emma studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who gazed back was someone she almost didn't recognize. Not because the scars were less visible, but because the elegant dress lent her a presence, a dignity that her practical traveling clothes didn't convey. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "It's lovely." "You're welcome." Clara began helping her out of the dress, careful with the pins. "Now, about your hair. I think we might try—" "Clara," Emma interrupted gently, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I'm not attempting to disguise my appearance. The town should see me as I am if I'm to teach their children." Clara paused, then nodded with what appeared to be approval. "Of course, though there's nothing wrong with presenting your best. Self, it's not deception to wear a flattering dress or arrange your hair pleasingly. Emma conceded the point with a smile. True, I just don't want to create an impression I can't maintain daily in a classroom. Fair enough, though I maintain that green is your color and should feature more prominently in your wardrobe. Clara folded the dress carefully. I'll make the adjustments this afternoon. It should be ready well before Saturday. After Clara departed, Emma changed back into her day dress and decided to take advantage of the pleasant weather for a walk. Her trunk had arrived while they were touring the town, delivered by one of the station master's assistants, but unpacking could wait. After the revelations and decisions of the morning, she needed solitude to sort through her thoughts. The town's modest size meant she quickly reached its outskirts, following a well-worn path that led toward the pine forest surrounding Pinecrest. The afternoon air was cool, but not uncomfortable, scented with pine resin and the earthy smell of spring growth. She walked without particular destination, simply enjoying the sensation of movement after days confined to train compartments and stagecoaches. The path eventually opened into a small clearing beside a stream, evidently a popular spot given the smoothed log that served as a crude bench near the water's edge. Emma sat, watching the clear water tumble over rocks, and allowed her mind to wander. What would it mean to stay in Pinecrest? To establish herself not as Harold Fletcher's mail-order bride, but as the town's teacher, independent and self-sufficient. The prospect was both daunting and exhilarating. She had come west seeking a new beginning, though not the one now presenting itself. Her thoughts shifted to Marshal Caldwell with his direct gaze and thoughtful speech. His defense of her qualifications in front of Fletcher had been unexpected, but appreciated. There was something compelling about him, a steadiness, a sense of purpose that resonated with her own practical nature. And the fact that he too bore visible evidence of past trauma created a connection, unspoken but undeniable. She was so absorbed in her reflections that she didn't immediately notice the approaching footsteps. Only when a shadow fell across the stream did she look up to find the very subject of her thoughts standing at the edge of the clearing. Marshal Caldwell appeared equally surprised to encounter her. "Miss Sullivan, I didn't expect to find anyone here." Emma stood, suddenly self-conscious about being discovered alone in what was clearly a secluded spot. "Marshal, I was just enjoying some fresh air after a rather eventful morning." He nodded in understanding. "This is one of the few peaceful spots within walking distance of town. I come here sometimes when I need to think." "Then I'm intruding. I should go." "No," he said quickly, then moderated his tone. "That is, there's no need to leave on my account. The stream doesn't belong to anyone." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the gurgling of the water and distant birdsong. Emma searched for something to say that wouldn't sound inane. "Was the situation at the saloon resolved safely?" she asked finally. "Yes, thankfully. More bluster than real danger once the gun was removed from the equation." He moved a few steps closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "May I?" He gestured to the far end of the log. "Of course." He sat, stretching his left leg out slightly in a way that suggested the walk might have aggravated his old injury. Emma noticed but didn't remark on it, suspecting he wouldn't welcome attention to the weakness. "Have you given more thought to the teaching position?" He asked after a moment. "I have. I'm attending the spring social on Saturday to meet more of the community before making a final decision." He nodded, absently running a hand along his bearded jaw. "It's a sensible approach. Pinecrest has its share of challenges, like any frontier town, but there are good people here, people who value education for their children, and some who might object to their children being taught by someone with my appearance." Emma added, preferring directness to polite evasion of the obvious. The Marshal considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Some, perhaps, at first. But prejudice tends to fade when confronted with capability. I've seen it happen before. The implication that he'd experienced similar judgment went unspoken, but understood. Emma studied him with new curiosity. How long have you been Marshal? Here. 3 years this summer. He shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position on the rough bench. Came here after drifting through several territories following the war. Pinecrest was lawless when I arrived. The previous Marshal had been run out of town by a gang that controlled the mines. That sounds dangerous. A hint of a smile crossed his face. It was, but I had little to lose at the time, and the town council was desperate enough to take a chance on a man with a war injury and no previous experience wearing a badge. Clearly their trust was well placed, Emma observed. Everyone I've met speaks highly of the changes you've brought. He shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. I simply enforced the basics. No stealing, no killing, disputes settled. By law rather than violence. The decent folks did the rest once they realized they outnumbered the troublemakers. His modesty was genuine, Emma realized, not false humility seeking greater praise. It made his earlier defense of her before Fletcher all the more meaningful. A man who didn't seek approval or recognition, acting solely on principle. Mayor, Thompson mentioned the cottage comes with the teaching position, she said, changing the subject slightly. It seems ideal for a single woman. It is. Miss Harrington kept it in good condition, though she complained the roof leaked during heavy rains. I believe that's been repaired since she left. He glanced at her, then added, the schoolhouse is within shouting distance of my office, should you ever need assistance. The offer was made casually, but Emma sensed genuine concern behind it. I've generally found children more manageable than adults, Marshal, even difficult ones like Tommy Fletcher. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. Tommy's bark is worse than his bite. He's had a hard time of it, losing both parents, then being placed with an uncle who views him more as an obligation than family. The boy acts out to get attention, any kind of attention. This insight into the child's circumstances aligned with Emma's own experiences teaching children from troubled backgrounds. That's often the case with difficult students. They need consistency and clear expectations, more than anything else. Precisely. The Marshal seemed pleased by her understanding. Fletcher indulges the boy one moment and ignores him the next, depending on his own convenience. It's no wonder Tommy seeks boundaries by testing them constantly. They fell into a more comfortable silence, watching the stream together. The afternoon light filtered through the pines, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was peaceful in a way Emma hadn't experienced since leaving Ohio. A momentary reprieve from decisions and judgments. I should return to town, Marshal Caldwell said eventually, though he made no immediate move to stand. Sundays are often quiet, but that can change quickly when the miners have a day off and too much time at the saloon. Emma stood reluctantly. Of course, I've taken enough of your time. You misunderstand, the Marshal said, also rising. I wasn't suggesting you should leave, only explaining why I must. He hesitated, then added with careful casualness, the path can be confusing for newcomers. I'd be happy to show you the way back to town if you're ready to return. Emma recognized the offer for what it was, an opportunity to continue their conversation, not an assumption of her incompetence. Thank you. I should get back to help Clara with supper preparations. They walked side by side along the narrow forest path, maintaining a respectable distance that nonetheless allowed conversation. The Marshal set a measured pace, which Emma suspected was as much for his comfort as for her convenience. "Clara mentioned you served at Antietam," she said, recalling their earlier discussion about his injury. She did. His tone suggested mild surprise at Clara sharing such personal information. "I apologize if that was private." "No," he interrupted gently. "Just unexpected. Clara usually guards others' confidences better than that." He was quiet for a few steps, then continued. "Yes, Antietam. Bloodiest day of the war. I was with the 5th Ohio Infantry. My brothers both served," Emma offered. "William with the 73rd Ohio, David with the 107th. They were fortunate to come home intact, at least physically." The Marshal nodded, understanding the unspoken acknowledgement of war's invisible wounds. Many weren't so fortunate on either count. They walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "The leg was actually later, at Gettysburg. Minier ball shattered the bone. Army surgeon wanted to amputate, but a civilian doctor intervened. Saved the leg, though it's never been the same." The admission seemed to cost him something, though his tone remained matter-of-fact. Emma sensed that Marshal Caldwell wasn't a man who easily shared personal details. "The fire that caused my scars," she said, offering an exchange of confidences, "happened when I pulled my brother's children from our home. Lightning strike during a summer storm. The roof collapsed just after I got the second child out." His gaze met hers, assessment giving way to something deeper, respect perhaps. "How many did you save?" "2. My nephews, Thomas and James, 7 and 5 at the time." She smiled faintly at the memory of their small faces, terrified but alive. "Everyone called it miraculous that they survived without a scratch. No one said the same about my scars. Courage often leaves marks," the Marshal said quietly. "Some visible, some not." The simple statement, delivered without sentimentality, struck Emma with unexpected force. In 4 years, no one had ever framed her scarring quite that way. As evidence of courage rather than misfortune or diminishment. Before she could respond, they emerged from the forest path onto the outskirts of town. The spell of privacy created by the woods lifted, replaced by the awareness of public scrutiny as several townsfolk noticed their arrival together. "Thank you for the escort, Marshal," Emma said, conscious of maintaining proprieties. He tipped his hat slightly. "Miss Sullivan." Then, more quietly, "Consider attending the spring social. Pinecrest should have the opportunity to know you beyond first impressions." With that, he turned toward his office, his slight limp more pronounced after their walk, but his posture unbowed. Emma watched him go, intrigued by the contradictions he embodied, the battle-hardened lawman who came to a stream to think, the wounded veteran who refused to be defined by his injuries, the reserved man who recognized and respected her own resilience. Clara, predictably, had questions when Emma returned to the boarding house. "I saw you walking back with the Marshal," she said, trying and failing to sound merely conversational as they prepared vegetables for supper. "We encountered each other by the stream," Emma explained, slicing carrots with practiced efficiency. "He was kind enough to guide me back to town." "Robert Caldwell doesn't do anything out of mere kindness," Clara observed. "Principle, yes. Duty, certainly, but not simple kindness." Emma considered this characterization. "You make him sound cold. He struck me as reserved, but thoughtful." A smile curved Clara's mouth. "Thoughtful, yes. Cold, no. Just particular about where he invests himself." She studied Emma's expression. "He defended you against Fletcher this morning. That's not something he does lightly. Involve himself in personal disputes." "It wasn't personal," Emma countered. "He was defending the town's educational standards, not me specifically." Clara made a non-committal sound that suggested she thought otherwise, but wouldn't press the point. "Did you decide about the spring social?" "I'll attend," Emma confirmed. "Though I hope it doesn't turn into an uncomfortable spectacle." "It might," briefly, Clara acknowledged with characteristic honesty. "New faces always attract attention in a small town, and yours will draw more than most. But these are largely good people, Miss Sullivan. They may stare, but they'll also listen and form judgments based on more than appearance given the chance." The remainder of the week passed with surprising speed as Emma settled into a routine at the boarding house. Her trunk had arrived from the station, allowing her to unpack properly and feel less like a transient visitor. She spent time each day exploring different parts of Pinecrest, sometimes with Clara as guide, other times alone. The town revealed itself as a community in transition, still rough around the edges, with its saloons and boarding houses catering to miners and lumbermen, yet increasingly populated by families with permanent homes, gardens, and aspirations towards civilization. The contrast between the frontier rawness and the efforts at refinement created a distinctive character that Emma found unexpectedly appealing. She encountered Marshal Caldwell several times during her explorations, their interactions brief but cordial. Each exchange reinforced her initial impression of him as a man of few words but substantive character. He never mentioned their more personal conversation by the stream, maintaining a professional distance in public that Emma found both disappointing and appropriate. Harold Fletcher proved less omnipresent than she had feared. She glimpsed him, once entering the bank and another time leaving the general store, but he seemed to go out of his way to avoid direct encounters, a circumstance for which Emma was grateful. His nephew Tommy, however, crossed her path on Thursday afternoon, a meeting that proved more illuminating than comfortable. Emma had been examining the small selection of books in Thompson's general store when a commotion near the candy jars caught her attention. A boy of about 11 or 12 with sandy hair and a defiant expression was arguing with the clerk. "I ain't stole nothing," he protested loudly. "Check my pockets if you don't believe me." "I've warned you before about handling merchandise without buying it, Tommy Fletcher," the clerk replied sternly. "Those licorice twists didn't walk themselves out of the jar." "I was just looking. You can't prove nothing." "I don't need to prove anything to ask you to leave my store." The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, gestured toward the door. Tommy's face flushed with anger and something else, embarrassment perhaps, at being publicly accused. "My uncle owns half this town. You can't throw me out." "Your uncle doesn't own this store," the clerk countered, though his tone suggested he was less certain about confronting someone connected to Harold Fletcher. Emma, watching the exchange, noticed the small black licorice twist partially visible in the boy's coat pocket. The situation struck her as less about theft than attention-seeking, a test of boundaries from a child who, as Marshal Caldwell had suggested, received inconsistent guidance. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the pair. Both turned to look at her, the clerk with surprise, Tommy with wary curiosity. His gaze immediately went to her scarred face, his expression shifting from wariness to fascinated discomfort. "You're the lady Uncle Harold was supposed to marry," he blurted out. "The one with the—" He gestured vaguely toward his own face. "Thomas Fletcher," Emma said firmly, ignoring the reference to her appearance. "Is that licorice in your pocket?" Caught off guard by her directness, the boy's hand instinctively moved to cover the partially visible candy. "No." "Young man, lying compounds the original offense." Emma held his gaze steadily. "The honorable course would be to return what you took, apologize to Mr. Adams," the clerk supplied. "Mr. Adams, and offer to work to repay the value of any candy you've already eaten." Tommy's expression cycled rapidly through defiance, guilt, and calculation. "Uncle Harold gives me money for candy. I don't need to steal it." "Then why did you?" Emma asked simply. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stood, speechless, for a moment, then thrust his hand into his pocket and pulled out the licorice twist, tossing it onto the counter. "It ain't worth the trouble anyway. Tastes like tar." With that, he darted out of the store, the bell above the door jingling wildly in his wake. Mr. Adams sighed, returning the candy to its jar. "That boy's headed for serious difficulties if someone doesn't take him in hand," he said, shaking his head. "Fletcher lets him run wild, then wonders why he causes trouble." "He seems to be testing boundaries," Emma observed, "to see which ones hold firm." The clerk looked at her with new interest. "You handled him better than most, Miss Sullivan, Emma Sullivan." Recognition dawned in his expression. "The lady considering our teaching position. Mayor Thompson mentioned you might be at the spring social." "Yes, I'm attending to meet more of the community before making a decision." "We could certainly use a teacher who can manage the likes of Tommy Fletcher," Mr. Adams said with feeling. "Though I don't envy anyone taking on that task, especially with his uncle, likely to undermine any attempt at discipline." The encounter left Emma thoughtful as she completed her purchases and returned to the boarding house. Tommy's behavior aligned with what Marshal Caldwell had told her about his situation. A child acting out to attract attention, testing limits because he lacked consistent ones. If she accepted the teaching position, the boy would be one of her most challenging students. Yet the brief interaction had also revealed something promising. Tommy had responded to direct questions and clear expectations, even if reluctantly. There was potential there beneath the defiance and bravado. The question was whether she would have the opportunity or authority to reach it, particularly given Harold Fletcher's influence. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle spring. Breeze, ideal weather for the evening's social. Clara spent the afternoon helping Emma prepare, making final adjustments to the green dress and offering suggestions for her hair that wouldn't conceal her scarring, but would frame her face advantageously. A community gathering like this sets the tone for how people will receive you, Clara explained, as she arranged Emma's auburn hair into a style more elegant than Emma would have attempted herself. First impressions matter, especially in a small town. "I thought you said appearance wasn't the primary concern in Pinecrest," Emma teased gently. Clara secured a final pin with decisive precision. "Character matters most, true, but there's no harm in presenting that character in its best light." There. She stepped back to assess her work. "Perfect. The green brings out your eyes beautifully, and your hair catches the light like autumn leaves." Emma studied her reflection in the mirror Clara held up. The woman who gazed back was undeniably scarred. Nothing could change the puckered skin that marked her right cheek and jaw. But she was also undeniably presentable. The high collar of the green dress concealed the worst of the scarring on her neck, while the careful arrangement of her hair drew attention to her clear hazel eyes and the unmarked left side of her face. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by Clara's efforts. "It's been a long time since I felt—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Beautiful," Clara suggested. "Appropriate," Emma amended with a small smile. "Ready to be seen." Clara's expression softened. "Beauty comes in many forms, Miss Sullivan. Some people just lack the vision to recognize it." They arrived at the church hall as twilight was fading into true evening. Lanterns hung from the porch rafters, casting a warm glow over the entrance, where Pastor Bennett stood greeting arrivals. The sounds of conversation and a fiddle being tuned drifted through the open doors. "Miss Sullivan," the pastor welcomed her warmly. "I'm delighted you decided to attend, and Clara, lovely as always." "Michael," Clara acknowledged with a nod that suggested long acquaintance. "Is Elizabeth Thompson torturing that poor fiddle, or has she improved since Christmas?" The pastor chuckled. Be charitable, Clara. Her enthusiasm compensates for any shortcomings in technique. Inside, the hall had been transformed from its usual austere functionality into a festive space. Tables lined the walls, laden with an impressive array of food, contributed by community members. Benches and chairs formed conversational groupings, while the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. Paper chains and spring wildflowers decorated the beams overhead, lending a cheerful atmosphere to the otherwise plain room. The gathering was already well attended, with perhaps 50 people of all ages engaged in conversation, sampling refreshments, or arranging themselves for the dancing soon to commence. Emma felt the immediate shift in attention as she entered, conversations pausing, glances redirecting, whispers beginning as recognitions spread. "Chin up," Clara murmured beside her. "You look lovely and you have every right to be here." Mayor Thompson approached, his wife at his side, a pleasantly round woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. "Miss Sullivan, I'm so glad you came. Allow me to introduce my wife, Elizabeth Thompson." Mrs. Thompson extended her hand without hesitation, her gaze meeting Emma's directly. "Welcome to Pinecrest, Miss Sullivan. George has told me about your teaching experience. I've been struggling to maintain any semblance of educational standards with the children, so your interest in the position is a godsend." "You're too modest, my dear," the mayor said affectionately. "The children have been learning their letters, and some's admirably under your guidance. Learning is one thing, George. Education is another entirely." Mrs. Thompson turned back to Emma. "Please come meet some of the parents. They're eager to speak with a proper teacher." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions as Mrs. Thompson guided Emma through the room. Parents with school-age children approached with varying degrees of curiosity and courtesy. Some asked thoughtful questions about her teaching philosophy and experience. Others made awkward small talk while trying not to stare at her scars. A few, particularly mothers with younger children, seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the prospect of experienced instruction for their offspring. Emma answered questions patiently, emphasizing her experience with multi-age classrooms and her belief in practical education tailored to frontier needs. She noticed that as conversations progressed, most people's initial focus on her scarring gave way to engagement with her ideas and personality, exactly as Clara had predicted. Not all interactions were positive, however. She observed a small group of women watching from across the room, their expressions ranging from dubious to disapproving. One, a sharp-featured blonde with an elaborately styled dress that seemed out of place in the frontier setting, whispered something that caused the others to look at Emma and frown in apparent agreement. "Victoria Reed," Clara murmured, noting the direction of Emma's gaze. "The closest thing Pinecrest has to Eastern society. She fancies herself above the rest of us because her husband's mine struck silver last year. Pay her no mind." Easier said than done when the woman in question began making her way determinedly toward them, her expression suggesting she had opinions to share. Before she could reach them, however, Lily Thompson darted in front of her, nearly colliding with Emma in her excitement. "Miss Sullivan, you came!" The girl beamed up at her. "Papa said you might be our new teacher. I've been telling everyone how you know about dinosaur bones and survived a fire. Tommy said I was making it up, but I told him you showed me your scars, so ha!" "Lily," Mrs. Thompson admonished gently, appearing at her daughter's side, "we've discussed appropriate topics of conversation." "But it's important, Mama. Miss Sullivan isn't ashamed of her scars, so why should we pretend not to see them? Billy Cross says his pa's burns show he's brave, and Miss Sullivan's must mean the same thing." The girl's forthright defense, delivered with absolute conviction, created a moment of startled silence among those nearby. Emma found herself unexpectedly moved by the child's innocent wisdom. "Thank you, Lily," she said warmly. That's a very kind way of looking at it. Victoria Reed, momentarily thwarted in her approach by the cluster that had formed around Emma and Lily, changed tactics and raised her voice to address Mrs. Thompson. "Elizabeth, dear, will the dancing begin soon? Some of us have made quite an effort with our appearance this evening." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Emma. "Though I suppose not everyone comes to these gatherings with the same social aspirations." The deliberate unkindness of the remark rippled through the nearby listeners, creating an uncomfortable tension. Emma felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't escalate the situation, an unexpected voice spoke from just behind her. "Some come to dance, Mrs. Reed, others to strengthen community bonds. Both seem valid aspirations for a town social." Emma turned to find Marshal Caldwell standing there, not in his usual working attire, but in a clean white shirt, dark waistcoat and pressed trousers. Still simple compared to the more elaborate dress of some attendees, but notably more formal than his daily appearance. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his unruly dark hair had been combed into submission, though a rebellious lock still fell across his forehead. Victoria Reed's expression soured further at his intervention. "Marshal, how unexpected to see you. At a social function. I was given to understand you found such gatherings frivolous." "Not frivolous, Mrs. Reed, simply not always compatible with my duties." His tone was polite but firm, brooking no argument. "Tonight, Deputy Parker is handling any disturbances, allowing me to participate in community life. As we all should." He nodded toward the cluster of women who had been observing with Mrs. Reed. "I believe your friends are waiting to begin the dancing." Effectively dismissed, Victoria Reed retreated with as much dignity as she could muster, throwing one final glare in Emma's direction before rejoining her companions. As she departed, Emma noticed several onlookers exchanging approving glances, suggesting that Mrs. Reed's influence was perhaps not as universal as she believed. "Thank you, Marshal," Emma said quietly when the moment had passed. "Though I fear you've made an enemy on my behalf." A hint of amusement crossed his face. "Mrs. Reed was no friend of mine before tonight, Miss Sullivan. Her husband's newfound wealth has convinced her that Pinecrest's social hierarchy should mirror Eastern society, with her at its peak. And you at its nadir, I imagine, despite your position. Law enforcement is necessary but hardly genteel. In her estimation." His gaze moved past her to where the musicians had begun assembling for the dancing. "Will you be participating in the festivities?" The question caught Emma off guard. "I hadn't planned to. I'm here primarily to meet parents and community members." "A valid purpose," he acknowledged, "though there's no reason it can't include dancing if you're so inclined. Community bonds form through shared enjoyment as much as conversation." Was he offering to dance with her? The possibility both alarmed and intrigued Emma. "I wouldn't want to impose on your evening, Marshal. You must have many people to speak with." "None I'm particularly eager to engage," he admitted with surprising candor. "My social graces are somewhat rusty." Before Emma could respond, Pastor Bennett called for attention from the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd form sets for the first dance, Mrs. Thompson and our fine musicians will lead us in a Virginia reel to begin the evening." There was a general movement as couples and individuals arranged themselves in two lines facing each other. Emma found herself being gently but inexorably guided forward by Clara on one side and Marshal Caldwell on the other. "I'm not certain," she began, but Clara interrupted smoothly. "Nonsense. The Virginia reel is simple enough, and the Marshal is an adequate partner despite his protests about social graces." She gave Caldwell a knowing look. "Isn't that right, Robert?" He inclined, his head slightly. "I manage not to trample toes, generally speaking." The exchange suggested a long-standing familiarity between them that piqued Emma's curiosity, but before she could inquire further, they had reached the forming lines. Clara deftly maneuvered away, leaving Emma standing opposite Marshal Caldwell. As Mrs. Thompson raised her fiddle and called out instructions, the music began, a lively tune that set toes tapping immediately. Emma followed the familiar steps of the reel, advancing and retreating, circling her partner and progressing down the line. Marshal Caldwell moved with unexpected grace despite his injury, his steps sure and his timing precise. When their hands met in the figures of the dance, his touch was light but steady, respectful of boundaries while maintaining the necessary contact for the patterns. As they moved through the dance, Emma became aware of curious glances from other participants and onlookers. Some were clearly surprised to see the reserved Marshal participating, others seemed interested in their partnership specifically. Yet as the music continued, Emma found herself caring less about the scrutiny and more about the simple pleasure of the movement, the momentary connections with her partner, and the communal joy of the gathering. When the dance concluded, breathless, participants applauded the musicians and began arranging themselves for the next selection. Marshal Caldwell offered his arm to escort Emma from the dance floor. "You're a far better dancer than you implied, Marshal," she observed as they moved toward the refreshment table. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The war left my leg damaged, not my memory of proper steps, though I admit it's been some time since I put that memory to use. Well, you've done your civic duty admirably. I'm sure everyone is suitably impressed by your participation." His expression sobered slightly. "I didn't ask you to dance to impress anyone, Miss Sullivan." The simple statement, delivered without pretense, caused a fluttering sensation in Emma's chest that had nothing to do with exertion from the dance. Before she could formulate a response, Mayor Thompson approached, his expression unusually grave. Given the festive setting, "Robert, Miss Sullivan," he greeted them, his voice lowered. "I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you should know. Harold Fletcher has just arrived with his nephew." Emma felt a chill, despite the warmth of the crowded room. She had hoped Fletcher might avoid the social, given their uncomfortable encounter earlier in the week. His presence complicated matters considerably, especially if he chose to make his opposition to her teaching position publicly known. Marshal Caldwell's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift from social participant to alert peacekeeper. "He's within his rights to attend, George. It's a community gathering." "Of course," the mayor agreed quickly. "I simply thought Miss Sullivan might appreciate the advance notice given their prior connection." Emma appreciated the warning, though it did little to ease her discomfort. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson. I'm sure Mr. Fletcher and I can maintain civil distance in a public setting." As if summoned by their discussion, Harold Fletcher appeared at the entrance to the hall, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. He was impeccably dressed, in what was clearly an Eastern-made suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his entire aspect projecting prosperity and authority. Beside him stood Tommy, looking uncomfortable in formal attire, his normally tousled hair slicked down, with what appeared to be an excessive application of Macassar oil. Conversations throughout the room faltered as people noticed the new arrivals, many glancing between Fletcher and Emma with poorly disguised curiosity. The potential drama of their first public encounter since her arrival was evidently too enticing to ignore. "Perhaps I should step outside for some air," Emma suggested, reluctant to become the center of a public spectacle. "That would appear like retreat," Marshal Caldwell said quietly. "Fletcher thrives on demonstrations of his influence. Continuing your evening normally would convey more strength." Mayor Thompson nodded agreement. "The Marshal's right. Most folks here have already formed favorable impressions of you, Miss Sullivan. Don't let Fletcher undermine that by seeming to drive you away." Their support bolstered Emma's resolve. "Very well. though I won't go out of my way to engage with him either." "A wise approach," the mayor approved. "Now, I believe Mrs. Thompson was hoping to introduce you to Mrs. Jensen, the blacksmith's wife. She has twins who will be starting school in the fall." With a meaningful glance toward the far side of the room, away from Fletcher's position, he offered his arm to escort her. Marshal Caldwell remained where he was, his attention now focused on Fletcher with the watchful assessment of a man anticipating potential trouble. As Emma moved away with the mayor, she glanced back to see Fletcher notice the marshal's scrutiny, the two men exchanging nods that contained neither warmth nor particular hostility, merely mutual acknowledgement of an unresolved tension. The remainder of the evening proceeded with a strained undercurrent beneath the surface conviviality. Emma continued meeting parents and community members, many of whom expressed enthusiasm about her possible acceptance of the teaching position. She danced twice more, once with Pastor Bennett and once with Mr. Adams from the general store, and sampled the impressive array of refreshments contributed by Pinecrest's households. Fletcher remained on the opposite side of the room, engaging, primarily with the wealthier mine owners and merchants, while Tommy fidgeted beside him, clearly bored by adult conversation. Emma noticed the boy casting frequent glances in her direction, his expression a mixture of curiosity and the defiance she'd witnessed in the store. It was during a momentary lull in the music and conversation that Victoria Reed seized her opportunity. Emma had stepped away from a discussion with Mrs. Jensen about the twins' educational needs when the blonde woman intercepted her, flanked by two companions whose expressions suggested they anticipated entertainment. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Reed began with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I understand you're considering becoming our school teacher. How charitable of you to offer your services to our little community." The emphasis on charitable carried clear implications that Emma's options must be severely limited to consider teaching in a frontier town. Before Emma could respond, Mrs. Reed continued, her voice pitched to carry to nearby listeners. "Though I wonder if you've considered the effect on impressionable children. My Amelia is particularly sensitive. Nightmares, you understand, and certain appearances might distress her delicate nature." The deliberate cruelty of the remark silenced conversations within earshot. Emma felt heat rise to her face, but years of managing similar, if usually less public insults had taught her to maintain composure. "Children often reflect their parents' reactions, Mrs. Reed," she replied evenly. "In my experience teaching in Ohio, they adapt quickly to physical differences when adults model acceptance." "Perhaps in Ohio," Mrs. Reed countered with a dismissive wave. "But Pinecrest has certain standards of refinement, despite its frontier location. Mr. Fletcher was just saying how important appearances are for the town's development. The direct invocation of Fletcher's opinion made her strategy clear. She was attempting to publicly align herself with the wealthiest man in town while undermining Emma's position. It was clumsy, but potentially effective given Fletcher's influence. "I wasn't aware Mr. Fletcher had appointed himself arbiter of the town's educational requirements," Emma said, struggling to maintain her composure as more people turned to observe the increasingly tense exchange. "Harold has Pinecrest's best interests at heart," Mrs. Reed insisted, "unlike certain opportunists who appear conveniently after being rejected for more personal positions." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Fletcher across the room. The implication was unmistakable, that Emma, having failed to secure Fletcher as a husband, was now attempting to establish herself in the town through alternative means. The whispers that followed suggested Mrs. Reed's insinuation had struck home with at least some listeners. Emma felt a momentary impulse to flee, to escape the judging eyes and whispered assessments. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw Marshal Caldwell moving toward them, his expression suggesting he intended to intervene. The last thing she wanted was to appear incapable of handling her own battles. "Mrs. Reed," she said, finding strength in the very rejection being thrown at her, "you seem to believe my interest in teaching stems from personal disappointment. Let me clarify matters for you and anyone else who might share your confusion." She raised her voice slightly, ensuring that those nearby could hear clearly. "I came to Pinecrest expecting to marry Mr. Fletcher based on a correspondence that lasted 6 months. Upon seeing my scarred appearance, he immediately terminated our arrangement without so much as a conversation. That was his right, disappointing as it was." Murmurs spread through the gathering as Emma continued, her voice steady. "Mayor Thompson subsequently informed me of your community's need for a qualified teacher. Having taught successfully for 2 years in Ohio, I expressed interest in the position based on its own merits, not as a consolation for personal rejection." She met Mrs. Reed's gaze directly. "As for the effect of my appearance on children, I find they are far more resilient and accepting than adults who use physical differences as weapons in social posturing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe Mrs. Thompson is signaling that the next dance is forming." Without waiting for Mrs. Reed's response, Emma turned and walked with deliberate dignity toward Mrs. Thompson, who was indeed gathering participants for another set. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation resuming, with several voices, sounding distinctly approving of her response. Mrs. Thompson welcomed her with a warm smile that contained a hint of satisfaction. "Well handled, my dear. Victoria Reed has needed someone to stand up to her petty tyranny for quite some time. I hope I haven't created additional complications for my potential position," Emma said, suddenly concerned that her public confrontation might be viewed as inappropriate for a teacher. "On the contrary," the mayor's wife assured her, "most parents here value forthrightness and moral courage far more than they worry about physical appearances. You've just demonstrated both." She glanced toward Fletcher, who was watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. "And you've made it clear that you're not to be intimidated, which carries significant weight in a frontier community." The music began again, a lively schottische that had couples forming throughout the hall. Emma, still somewhat shaken by the confrontation despite her outward composure, moved to the side of the room, intending to observe rather than participate. It was there that Marshal Caldwell found her, approaching with quiet purpose that suggested he had been waiting for an opportunity to speak privately. "That was well done," he said simply, coming to stand beside her. "Mrs. Reed isn't accustomed to being countered so effectively." "I probably shouldn't have been quite so direct," Emma admitted, "but I found I couldn't stomach the insinuations." "Directness is undervalued," the Marshal observed, "particularly when it's deployed in defense of truth rather than as a weapon." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the dancers circle the floor. Emma noticed Fletcher speaking intently with Walter Simmons from the bank, both men occasionally glancing in her direction. Tommy had disappeared from his uncle's side, probably escaped to find company his own age. "Fletcher appears to be consolidating his position," she noted, nodding subtly toward the pair. Marshal Caldwell followed her gaze. "Simmons sits on the school board. Fletcher's likely trying to influence him against your appointment. Can he succeed? Possibly. Simmons owes Fletcher money for lumber used in his new home, but the mayor has the deciding vote, and George Thompson isn't easily swayed by financial pressure." He shifted slightly, his weight favoring his good leg. "Besides, after tonight, public opinion seems to be turning in your favor. That carries weight, even with politicians." The observation should have been reassuring, but Emma found herself suddenly overwhelmed by the complexities of the situation. She had come to Wyoming seeking simplicity, a straightforward exchange of companionship and domestic skills for security and position. Instead, she found herself embroiled in small-town politics and personal animosities, all centered around her scarred appearance. "Perhaps it would be simpler to continue east after all," she said quietly, voicing the doubt that had been growing since her confrontation with Mrs. Reed. "Teaching here would mean navigating these undercurrents daily. I'm not certain it's worth the constant battle." Marshal Caldwell was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "When I first took the badge here, a group of miners decided I wasn't fit for the position because of my war injury. They thought a man who couldn't run properly couldn't enforce the law. They made a point of testing that theory frequently, creating disturbances at opposite ends of town, starting fights they thought I couldn't finish, spreading word that Pinecrest had a cripple for a marshal." His tone remained conversational, but Emma could sense the steel beneath it as he continued. "I could have moved on, found a town that didn't question my capabilities based on visible damage. There were plenty of settlements hungry for anyone, with a legal mind and steady hand." "What made you stay?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. His gaze met hers directly. "Partly stubbornness, partly the belief that running from judgment only ensures you'll face it again elsewhere, perhaps in a community less worth fighting for. But mostly because I saw potential here, people building something meaningful despite the rough edges and petty conflicts." The simple honesty of his answer resonated with Emma. She, too, had sensed the potential in Pinecrest. A community taking shape, families establishing roots, children who deserved education regardless of frontier limitations. And beneath that, a personal potential she hadn't anticipated, the possibility of building a life defined by her capabilities rather than her scars. "You make a compelling case for perseverance, Marshal," she said softly. "Robert, then?" Emma acknowledged, the name feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. "And you should call me Emma, at least in similar circumstances." A hint of a smile crossed his face, a rare expression that transformed his features from merely handsome to genuinely warm. Before he could respond, however, a commotion near the refreshment table drew their attention. Tommy Fletcher stood amid a spreading puddle of punch, his face flushed with embarrassment as several women rushed to salvage soaked tablecloths and toppled plates of cookies. "I didn't mean to," the boy protested as Victoria Reed berated him, her elaborate dress splattered with crimson droplets. "I was just trying to get a cup." "Destructive little heathen," Mrs. Reed hissed, dabbing futilely at her ruined skirts. "This is precisely why certain children need proper supervision and discipline." Harold Fletcher pushed through the gathering crowd, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the scene. "Thomas, what have you done now?" Tommy's face crumpled at his uncle's tone, defiance giving way to genuine distress. "It was an accident, Uncle Harold. The pitcher was too heavy, and when I tried to set it down—" "Excuses," Fletcher cut him off sharply. "Always excuses with you. Go wait outside while I apologize for your behavior. Again." The public humiliation was clearly not a new experience for the boy, but that made it no less painful to witness. Tommy's shoulders hunched as he tried to make himself smaller, eyes downcast, body tense with the anticipation of further reproval. Emma moved before she had fully formed the conscious decision to intervene, weaving through onlookers until she reached the mortified child. "Tommy," she said quietly, positioning herself between him and the disapproving adults, "accidents happen to everyone. Why don't you help me clean this up, and then we can get Mrs. Reed a fresh cup of punch to replace the one you spilled." The boy looked up, confusion replacing shame as he registered who was speaking to him. "You want me to help?" "Of course. That's how we learn to handle mistakes. Acknowledge them, fix what we can, and move forward." She handed him a napkin from the table while taking another herself. "The floor first, I think, before someone slips." Fletcher stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Miss Sullivan, this isn't necessary. Thomas will wait outside while the mess is dealt with. Sending him away doesn't teach him anything, Mr. Fletcher, Emma replied evenly, except perhaps that mistakes are unforgivable rather than opportunities to demonstrate character. The direct challenge to his authority, delivered in front of many of Pinecrest's prominent citizens, clearly caught Fletcher off guard. His expression hardened, but before he could respond, Mrs. Thompson intervened with brisk efficiency. Miss Sullivan is absolutely right, she declared, handing more napkins to Tommy. What better lesson than to see how mature people handle accidents? Victoria, come with me, dear. I have something that will take those stains right out if we treat them quickly. With remarkable deftness, the mayor's wife drew the protesting Mrs. Reed away, leaving Fletcher standing awkwardly as Emma and Tommy began mopping up the spilled punch. After a moment's hesitation, Marshal Caldwell knelt to assist them, despite his injured leg, making the position clearly uncomfortable. The pitcher doesn't appear broken, he observed, carefully setting it upright. That's fortunate. Tommy glanced at him warily, then at his uncle, who remained standing stiffly nearby. Are you gonna arrest me, Marshal? Robert's expression remained serious, though Emma detected a hint of amusement in his eyes. Spilling punch isn't a criminal offense in this territory, Tommy, though destruction of property can be, so it's good you're helping with the cleanup. The boy seemed to relax slightly at this matter-of-fact response. He worked silently for a few minutes, studiously wiping punch from the floorboards. The small crowd gradually dispersed as the drama resolved into mundane cleaning efforts, conversations resuming and the musicians starting another tune to redirect attention. That should do it, Emma said finally, surveying their work. The floor was still sticky, but the visible evidence of the accident had been removed. Thank you for your help, Tommy. The boy nodded awkwardly, clearly unused to being thanked. Nothing, he mumbled, then with a glance toward his still-watching uncle, added more clearly, You're welcome, Miss Sullivan. Fletcher beckoned impatiently, and Tommy moved toward him with visible reluctance. Emma overheard Fletcher's low reprimand as they walked away, completely embarrassing display, and expected better behavior among the phrases that carried to her ears. That boy needs consistency more than criticism, Robert observed quietly as he helped Emma to her feet. Agreed, though I doubt his uncle sees the distinction. She brushed off her skirts, grimacing at a small splash of punch that had landed on the borrowed green dress. Clara will forgive me, I hope. Clara has seen worse than punch stains in her years running the boarding house, Robert assured her with a hint of a smile. He glanced toward the exit where Fletcher and Tommy had disappeared. Your intervention was kind. Not everyone would have shown such patience. It wasn't entirely selfless, Emma admitted. If I take the teaching position, I'll need to establish a different relationship with Tommy than the one his uncle maintains. This seemed like an opportunity to begin that process. Robert studied her with newfound interest. You're considering the position more seriously then? Yes, she said, realizing as she spoke that the decision had indeed been forming throughout the evening. The community needs a teacher, and despite certain complications, I find I'm drawn to the opportunity. Complications like Fletcher's opposition and Mrs. Reed's prejudice, among others. Emma hesitated, then added more quietly, including whatever this is between us, Robert. His expression shifted to one of careful neutrality. I'm not sure I understand. I think you do. She met his gaze steadily. You sought me out this evening, intervened with Mrs. Reed, offered support when others might have remained silent. Those aren't the actions of someone maintaining mere professional courtesy toward a potential new resident. For a moment, she thought he might retreat behind formal professionalism, deny the growing connection they both felt. Instead, He surprised her with candor. "No, they're not," he acknowledged, "though I hadn't intended to be quite so transparent. Fortunately, I don't find transparency objectionable," Emma said, a smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. Before Robert could respond, Pastor Bennett approached, his expression concerned. "Marshal, there's a situation outside that might benefit from your attention. Fletcher and Jensen seem to be having forceful disagreement near the church steps." Robert's demeanor instantly shifted from personal to professional. "Excuse me, Miss Sullivan, it seems duty calls." "Of course," she nodded, watching, as he moved purposefully toward the exit, his slight limp more pronounced after kneeling to help with the cleanup. The pastor lingered, glancing between Emma and the departing Marshal with perceptive eyes. "Robert Caldwell is a good man," he said after a moment, "though not one who opens himself easily to others." "I've noticed," Emma replied, uncertain, how to respond to the pastor's implicit observation of their developing connection. "The war left more than physical scars, you understand." Pastor Bennett's tone was gentle but direct. "For many men, but perhaps especially for those like the Marshal, who feel the weight of every life lost under their command." Emma considered this new information thoughtfully. He mentioned serving at Antietam and Gettysburg. "Yes, Captain Caldwell, 5th Ohio Infantry. His company suffered heavy casualties at Gettysburg, the same engagement where he received his injury. He rarely speaks of it." "Yet you're telling me," Emma observed, curious about the pastor's purpose in sharing such personal details. Pastor Bennett smiled slightly. "Consider it context, Miss Sullivan, not gossip. Robert has been alone since arriving in Pinecrest 3 years ago, dedicated to his duties, but holding himself apart from deeper connections. Until recently." The implication was clear, and Emma felt a flush rising to her cheeks. "Pastor, I've only been in Pinecrest a week. Whatever you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," he interrupted gently, "merely observing that damaged souls sometimes recognize one another in ways the unscathed cannot understand. Now, I believe Mrs. Jensen was hoping to introduce you to her sister, who has 3 school-age children. Shall we?" The remainder of the evening passed without further incident. Robert returned briefly to inform Emma that the disagreement outside had been resolved without serious issue. Fletcher and the blacksmith had been arguing over the price of iron fixtures for the lumber mill's expansion, their dispute inflamed by the punch served at the social, which had been liberally enhanced with spirits by someone's flask. "Fletcher's taking Tommy home," he added. "The boy looks exhausted by the evening's events." "Not surprising," Emma said. "Social gatherings can be overwhelming for children, especially when they feel they're being judged for every action." Robert nodded in agreement. "Fletcher means well for the boy in his way, but he has little understanding of children's needs beyond material provision. Perhaps that will change with time and observation." "Perhaps," he echoed, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Will you be returning to the boarding house soon? I'd be happy to escort you if you're ready to leave." The offer was professional in tone, but personal in intent, an opportunity to continue their interrupted conversation away from the crowded social. Emma found herself torn between proper caution and genuine desire to accept. "That's very kind," she began. "But Clara will undoubtedly remain until the very last plate is washed and put away," Robert finished with a knowing look. "She takes her role as a community elder very seriously, particularly at gatherings like this." Emma smiled at the accurate characterization of her landlady. "In that case, yes, I would appreciate an escort." Let me just inform Clara so she doesn't worry." Clara, predictably, showed no surprise at the arrangement, merely nodding with too innocent approval when Emma explained that the Marshal had offered to see her safely back to the boarding house. "Very sensible," she said, her eyes twinkling. With poorly disguised satisfaction, the streets can be treacherous after dark, even in a well-ordered town like Pinecrest. The walk from the church hall to the boarding house took only 10 minutes at a leisurely pace, but the cool evening air and relative privacy created a welcome respite after the social's constant interactions and scrutiny. They walked in companionable silence at first, adjusting to the quiet after the noise of the gathering. "You handled yourself admirably tonight," Robert said eventually. Many newcomers would have been overwhelmed by that level of attention, even without Mrs. Reed's deliberate provocation. "I've had practice managing uncomfortable scrutiny," Emma replied. "Though I admit, confronting it directly as I did with Mrs. Reed isn't my usual approach. It was effective. Most people respected your candor from what I observed." They turned onto the side street where the boarding house stood, its windows still dark as Clara and most of the other residents remained at the social. The moonlight cast long shadows across the boardwalk as they approached. "Have you decided about the teaching position?" Robert asked, his tone carefully neutral, despite the personal interest she suspected lay behind the question. Emma nodded. "Yes, I believe I have. Barring any unforeseen complications, I intend to accept Mayor Thompson's offer. The community needs a teacher, and I find I'm not ready to continue east as I originally planned." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The moonlight illuminated half his face while leaving the scarred side in shadow, a visual echo of Emma's own divided appearance. "I'm glad to hear it. Pinecrest would benefit from your presence." "And what about you, Robert?" she asked quietly, emboldened by the evening's events and the privacy of the deserted street. "Would you benefit from my presence as well?" It was a forward question, perhaps inappropriately so, given their short acquaintance, but Emma found she needed clarity about his intentions. If his interest was merely professional courtesy toward a newcomer, she wanted to know before her own. Feelings developed further. His expression remained serious, but something in his eyes softened. "I believe I would," he said simply. "More than might be considered proper to admit at this stage." The honesty of his response both surprised and pleased her. Propriety seems somewhat flexible in frontier territories. "In some matters," he agreed, "though there are still expectations for a town marshal and a schoolteacher, particularly a schoolteacher who has already drawn significant attention due to circumstances beyond her control." Emma understood his meaning immediately. Any developing relationship between them would be subject to intense scrutiny, potentially complicating her already delicate position in the community. Fletcher's opposition to her appointment could easily expand to include criticism of her personal connections as well. "You're suggesting caution," she said, unable to keep a hint of disappointment from her voice. "I'm suggesting awareness," he corrected gently. "Not concealment or denial, but recognition that small communities observe everything and form judgments. Quickly, I wouldn't want to make your position here more challenging than it already promises to be." The consideration behind his words touched her deeply. Here was a man concerned not with appearances or social advantage, but with her genuine welfare and success in her chosen role. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness," she said, "though I hope it doesn't preclude the possibility of further acquaintance. As we both adjust to the new circumstances." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I believe I could manage that balance with reasonable skill, Miss Sullivan." "Emma," she reminded him, returning his smile. "Emma," he echoed, her name spoken with a warmth that lingered in the cool evening air between them. They had reached the boarding house steps, Propriety dictated that he should bid her good night here, perhaps with a formal handshake or merely a polite nod. Instead, Robert hesitated, clearly weighing something in his mind before speaking again. "May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps in the afternoon when your other obligations permit? There's a matter I'd like to discuss further, away from the constraints of public gatherings." The formal request, so properly delivered yet laden with personal meaning, caused Emma's heart to quicken despite her usual pragmatism. "I'd like that," she replied simply. "Around 2 o'clock, if that suits you. Clara typically rests then, and the parlor would be private." 2 o'clock, he confirmed with a nod. "Until then, good night, Emma." "Good night, Robert." She watched him walk away, his figure gradually fading into the shadows of the quiet street before entering the boarding house. As she prepared for bed in her small room, Emma found her thoughts oscillating between practical considerations about the teaching position and less practical reflections on the Marshal's steady gaze and unexpected openness. Whatever lay ahead, in Pinecrest, whether challenge or opportunity, acceptance or continued judgment, she was increasingly certain that her decision to remain was the right one. Not because it was easy or safe, but because it offered the possibility of building something meaningful from the ashes of her original plans. Morning brought clear skies and the comforting routine of Sunday breakfast at the boarding house. Clara, despite having stayed at the social well into the night, was as energetic as ever, serving fresh biscuits and strong coffee while recounting highlights of the evening for Mrs. Winters, who had retired early. "Victoria Reed's dress was quite ruined," she reported with poorly concealed satisfaction. 3 inches of bright red punch along the hemline and splashes all up the skirt. Serves her right for wearing white satin to a community gathering. Impractical and ostentatious. The Fletcher boy responsible, I understand," Mrs. Winters said, stirring honey into her tea. "That child needs a firm hand. His uncle spoils him with things while neglecting his character entirely." Emma, who had been quietly enjoying her breakfast, felt compelled to intervene. "Tommy's behavior was entirely accidental, Mrs. Winters. Children sometimes misjudge their capabilities, especially in unfamiliar settings. He helped clean up the mess very responsibly." The elderly woman's sharp eyes assessed Emma with newfound interest. "Thanks to your intervention, I'm told. Most young women would have stayed well clear of such a situation, especially given your particular history with the Fletcher family." Emma glanced at Clara, who shrugged unrepentantly. "Small towns, my dear. Conversations continue long after formal gatherings end." "Well, I think it showed admirable character," Mrs. Winters declared firmly. "Standing up to Harold Fletcher in public takes courage, even without the personal complications. Most of the town agrees, from what I've heard this morning." "You've heard from people already today?" Emma asked, surprised at the speed of information flow. Mrs. Winters smiled enigmatically. "Pastor Bennett stops by after early services for coffee and updates. I may be old, but I remain well informed." The conversation shifted to other topics as Mr. Langley joined them, eager to share his observations from the social for potential inclusion in his newspaper. Emma listened with only half her attention, her mind already turning to her planned meeting with Mayor Thompson to formally accept the teaching position and then to Robert's afternoon visit. After breakfast, Emma changed into her Sunday best, a navy blue dress with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, and walked to the church for morning services. The small white building was filled nearly to capacity with families dressed in their finest and children squirming on hard wooden pews. Emma chose a seat near the back, hoping to observe without drawing undue attention. It proved a futile hope. Her entrance caused a ripple of awareness through the congregation, with nudges and whispered comments barely disguised as welcome. She recognized many faces from the previous evening's social, their expressions ranging from friendly curiosity to reserved assessment to outright disapproval in the case of Victoria Reed and her companions. Harold Fletcher sat near the front, with Tommy beside him, both impeccably dressed and rigidly upright. Neither turned to acknowledge her arrival, though Tommy fidgeted constantly, earning several sharp glances from his uncle. The contrast between the boy's natural exuberance and Fletcher's stern expectations was painfully apparent even from a distance. Pastor Bennett conducted the service with eloquence and sincerity, his sermon focusing on community and acceptance, themes that seemed particularly relevant given recent events, though Emma suspected they were regular touchpoints in his ministry to a frontier congregation composed of diverse backgrounds and circumstances. True community, he emphasized, his gaze sweeping across the gathered worshippers, is not built on uniformity of appearance or circumstance, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. When we allow superficial differences to divide us, we diminish not only our neighbors, but ourselves. Emma couldn't help wondering if the message was at least partly intended for her benefit, an encouragement to remain steadfast, despite opposition perhaps, or a reminder to the congregation of their better natures. Either way, she found comfort in the words, and in the murmurs of agreement they elicited from many present. After the service concluded, Pastor Bennett made a point of greeting her personally at the door, his handshake warm and his words deliberate enough to be overheard by those nearby. "Miss Sullivan, I hope we'll be seeing you regularly in our congregation. A community's education and spiritual guidance should work in harmony. Don't you agree?" "I do, Pastor," she replied, understanding his intent to publicly signal support for her potential appointment, "and I look forward to contributing to that harmony should my discussions with Mayor Thompson prove fruitful." The exchange had its desired effect. Several parents approached immediately afterward, expressing enthusiasm about her teaching their children and inviting her to various home gatherings in the coming weeks. Even those who had seemed uncertain at the social now appeared more welcoming, influenced by the pastor's clear endorsement. Fletcher observed these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his attention unmistakable. Tommy had broken free of his supervision to join a group of boys his age, his earlier embarrassment apparently forgotten in the bright morning sunlight and prospect of Sunday freedom from adult constraints. Emma was speaking with Mrs. Jensen about the twins' reading progress when Mayor Thompson approached, his expression suggesting he had specific business to discuss. "Miss Sullivan," he greeted her cordially, "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation about the teaching position. The school board will be meeting tomorrow evening to discuss the upcoming term, and I'd like to present your decision if you've reached one." "I have, Mayor," Emma confirmed. "I'd be pleased to accept the position, provided the terms remain as discussed." His face brightened visibly. "Excellent! The terms stand exactly as outlined. Salary, accommodations, and responsibilities. When would you be able to begin? The children have been without formal instruction for nearly 2 months now." "I could move into the cottage tomorrow," Emma suggested, "and perhaps begin classes by Wednesday. That would give me a day to organize materials and review Miss Harrington's curriculum notes." "Perfect," the mayor agreed enthusiastically. "I'll inform the board today and have the cottage prepared. Elizabeth has kept it dusted and aired in anticipation of a new teacher, but we'll make sure it's fully ready for occupancy." As they discussed practical details of the transition, Emma noticed Fletcher detach himself from a conversation with Walter Simmons and approach them with determined strides. The mayor's brief grimace suggested he, too, had observed Fletcher's movement and anticipated the coming confrontation. "George," Fletcher addressed the mayor without preamble, pointedly ignoring Emma, "I understand you're proceeding with Miss Sullivan's appointment without consulting the full board." Mayor Thompson's expression remained pleasant but firm. Not at all, Harold. I'm simply confirming Miss Sullivan's interest prior to our scheduled meeting. The formal vote will proceed as planned. A vote that seems predetermined, Fletcher observed, with barely concealed irritation. Given your public advocacy for her candidacy despite legitimate concerns. What concerns might those be? Emma asked directly, refusing to be discussed as if absent. Beyond your personal discomfort with my appearance, Mr. Fletcher? Her directness clearly caught him off guard. Fletcher's gaze shifted to her, then away again, as if he found looking at her scarred face distasteful. This isn't about personal matters, Miss Sullivan. It's about appropriateness and community standards. A teacher holds a position of influence over impressionable children who need education, guidance, and examples of character. Mayor Thompson interrupted smoothly, all of which Miss Sullivan has demonstrated she can provide. Her qualifications are superior to any other candidates we've identified. We haven't looked beyond Pinecrest, Fletcher countered. With a proper search and appropriate compensation, surely we could attract someone more, suitable from a larger settlement. The implication hung in the air, all the more offensive for remaining unspoken, that Emma's scars made her inherently unsuitable regardless of qualifications. Several nearby conversations had quieted as people observed the exchange, the aftermath of church services transforming into impromptu theater. Emma felt a familiar anger rising, not hot and defensive as it had been with Victoria Reed, but cold and clarifying. This man had rejected her based solely on appearance, denied her basic courtesy, and now sought to prevent her from establishing herself independently. Each action stemmed from the same shallow judgment, that her value was diminished by the physical evidence of her sacrifice. Mr. Fletcher, she said, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil, your continued opposition to my appointment appears to stem from personal animus rather than professional concern. Perhaps you might explain to these good people why you believe burn scars acquired while saving children from a fire render someone unfit to teach their sons and daughters? I'm genuinely curious about your reasoning. The direct challenge, delivered in front of much of the congregation still lingering outside the church, placed Fletcher in an impossible position. To articulate his objections would require voicing prejudices most frontier communities, built on resilience and practical value rather than appearances, would find distasteful. To retreat would mean conceding her point about his personal motivations. I merely think, he began, then stopped, visibly recalculating his approach. The children's welfare must be our primary consideration. On that, we completely agree, Emma replied, seizing the opening, which is why I intend to provide them with the best education my experience and training allow, in an environment that teaches not only academics, but also character, including the understanding that true worth lies beyond surface appearances. A murmur of approval rippled through the gathering observers. Emma noticed several parents nodding in agreement, while even some of Victoria Reed's usual allies looked uncomfortable with Fletcher's position. The tide of community opinion was turning visibly against him, a development he clearly hadn't anticipated. Fletcher's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Tommy appeared at his side, breathless from running. Uncle Harold, can I go fishing? With Billy and James. Billy's pa says he'll take us to the river if you say it's all right. The interruption fractured the tension of the moment. Fletcher glanced down at his nephew with barely concealed irritation. Not now, Thomas. We're discussing important matters. But you promised last week that on Sunday after church... Thomas! Fletcher's voice sharpened with impatience. This is not the time. Go wait by the carriage. The boy's face fell, disappointment replacing excitement. Without another word, he turned and trudged toward the waiting carriage, shoulders slumped in a posture of familiar resignation. Emma watched him go, struck by how neatly the exchange illustrated Fletcher's priorities, appearances and control above understanding or compassion. The pattern extended from his treatment of her to his handling of his orphaned nephew, consistent in its rigidity and lack of empathy. Perhaps, she suggested quietly, keeping promises to children might be considered among those important matters, Mr. Fletcher, especially when those children have already experienced significant loss. Fletcher's expression darkened at the implied criticism. My guardianship of Thomas is none of your concern, Miss Sullivan. As the teacher who will be responsible for his education and well-being during school hours, I believe it is very much my concern, Emma countered. Just as the education and welfare of all Pinecrest's children is now my professional responsibility. Mayor Thompson intervened before Fletcher could respond, his tone conciliatory but firm. The board meeting tomorrow will address any remaining questions about Miss Sullivan's appointment. Until then, Harold, I suggest we all enjoy what remains of our Sunday. The weather's perfect for fishing, as Tommy noted. Effectively dismissed and clearly aware of his disadvantageous position, Fletcher offered a stiff nod before turning to leave. The gathered onlookers began dispersing as well, though Emma overheard several approving comments about her handling of the confrontation. Well done, Mayor Thompson said quietly when they were relatively alone, though perhaps not the most diplomatic approach to a school board member. I apologize if I've complicated matters, Emma replied, suddenly concerned she might have overstepped. But I couldn't allow such implications to go unchallenged, especially in front of parents whose children I hope to teach. No apology needed, he assured her. Fletcher's objections stem from wounded pride more than genuine concern. The rest of the board will approve your appointment regardless of his position. He glanced toward the departing carriages. Though I fear Tommy may bear the brunt of his uncle's displeasure this afternoon. Emma followed his gaze, troubled by the same realization. The boy deserves better. Yes, the mayor agreed soberly. Though better is hard to define in legal terms, Fletcher provides materially for him, which satisfies the requirements of guardianship under territorial law. Emotional nurturing is harder to mandate or measure, Emma added, thinking of the complex dynamics she'd observed between uncle and nephew, though its absence leaves marks as surely as any physical neglect. Mayor Thompson nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps having a teacher who recognizes the truth will be its own kind of benefit for Tommy and children like him. Another reason I'm gratified by your acceptance of the position. After finalizing arrangements for the next day's transition to the teacher's cottage, Emma walked back to the boarding house, her mind filled with conflicting emotions. Pride in standing her ground against Fletcher's prejudice mingled with concern about Tommy's welfare and anticipation about her upcoming conversation with Robert. Beneath it all ran a current of cautious optimism that in this small frontier town, despite its complications and conflicts, she might build something meaningful from the ruins of her original expectations. Clara was preparing Sunday dinner when Emma returned, the fragrant scent of roasting chicken filling the boarding house. There you are. I expected you back sooner. The congregation must have been particularly sociable today. There was some additional discussion after services, Emma explained, helping to set the dining table without being asked. About the teaching position. Clara's hands paused in their work with the intuition of someone well-versed in community dynamics. Fletcher making trouble. Attempting to, Emma confirmed, taking plates from the cabinet, though I believe he found less support than he expected. Clara smiled knowingly. Not surprising. Fletcher may have money and influence, but he's never been well-liked, too rigid, too concerned with appearances. She glanced at Emma with shrewd assessment. Unlike our Marshal, who I understand escorted you home last night." Emma felt a flush rising to her cheeks. News does travel quickly. "Mrs. Winters has eyes everywhere, despite her complaints about failing vision," Clara said with a chuckle. "She reported that Robert looked quite handsome in his Sunday best, and that your conversation appeared most engaging." Rather than deny the obvious, Emma decided honesty was the simplest approach. "Marshal Caldwell, Robert, is calling this afternoon to continue our discussion away from public scrutiny." Clara's eyebrows rose with delighted surprise. "Is he indeed? Well, I believe I'll need to visit Mrs. Jensen after dinner to discuss the church auxiliary. The parlor should be perfectly private around 2 o'clock. "Thank you," Emma said, grateful for Clara's understanding without needing further explanation. "Though nothing improper is intended, we're merely exploring possibilities." "The best relationships begin that way," Clara observed, turning back to her cooking, "with honest exploration rather than hasty certainty. Speaking of which, have you made your decision about the teaching position?" "Yes, I've accepted. I'll move to the teacher's cottage tomorrow." The older woman nodded with evident satisfaction. "A wise choice. You'll make an excellent teacher for Pinecrest's children. Though I'll miss having you at the boarding house. You've brought fresh perspective to our little circle." Emma was touched by the sentiment. "I'll visit often, and I hope you'll call at the cottage as well." "Count on it," Clara promised with a warm smile. "Now, help me finish this dinner before our fellow boarders revolt from hunger." The afternoon arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the parlor windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air as Emma waited for Robert's arrival. She had changed from her church dress into a simpler blue gown that Clara had assured her was both appropriate and becoming, her hair neatly arranged but without elaborate styling. Precisely at 2 o'clock, a knock sounded at the boarding house door. Emma smoothed her skirts, took a steadying breath, and went to answer it. Robert stood on the porch, also changed from his church attire into his more familiar everyday clothing. Though his shirt was crisp and his hair neatly combed, he held his hat in his hands, a posture that conveyed respect rather than uncertainty. "Good afternoon, Emma," he greeted her, the use of her given name deliberate but still carrying a hint of novelty. "I hope I'm not intruding on your Sunday rest." "Not at all," she assured him, stepping back to allow him entry. "Clara has conveniently found errands to occupy her, and the other boarders are either napping or out enjoying the fine weather. The parlor is quite private." She led him to the comfortable sitting room, where afternoon sunlight created pools of warmth on the faded but well-maintained furnishings. They sat facing each other, a proper distance maintained between them despite the absence of observers. "I've accepted the teaching position," Emma said, deciding to begin with practical matters. "I'll be moving to the cottage tomorrow and beginning classes by Wednesday." "I'm glad to hear it," Robert replied with evident sincerity. "The children need proper teaching, and you've already demonstrated an aptitude for handling challenging students like Tommy Fletcher." "His situation concerns me," she admitted. "Fletcher seems more interested in controlling the boy than understanding him." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Tommy lost both parents within weeks of each other. Fever took his mother first, then his father, Fletcher's younger brother. Harold was the only family available to take him in, but he's never shown much instinct for nurturing." "The boy acts out to get attention," Emma observed. "Even negative attention. A common pattern with neglected children," Robert agreed. "One you seem particularly attuned to recognizing." There was a question in his statement, an invitation to share more of her background that Emma found herself willing to accept. "My own father became distant after my mother's death, not cruel, but absent in the ways that matter most to a child. I learned to recognize the signs in others. Robert absorbed this information with quiet understanding. And your brothers? You mentioned saving their children from the fire. William and David managed better than our father did. They built good lives, married well, started families. She touched her scarred cheek unconsciously. The fire changed many things, but their children are thriving despite it, despite what it cost. What you willingly paid, Robert corrected gently. There's a difference between being marked by circumstance and choosing sacrifice for others' welfare. The distinction struck Emma deeply. She had never quite framed her scarring in those terms, as a choice rather than a misfortune. Yet there was truth in his perspective. Given the same circumstances, she would make the same decision again, without hesitation. You see things differently than most, she said after a moment. Perhaps because I've had cause to reconsider what matters, he replied. War has a way of clarifying priorities, as I imagine life-threatening fires do as well. His understanding, offered without platitudes or pity, created a space between them where honesty felt not only possible, but necessary. In that moment, Emma recognized the rarity of such connection, with someone who saw beyond surfaces to essential truths. You mentioned yesterday that there was a matter you wished to discuss, she prompted, curious about his purpose in arranging. Their meeting. Robert's expression grew more serious. Yes, I wanted to speak with you about Fletcher's opposition to your appointment, and specifically about the board meeting tomorrow evening. Do you anticipate problems? Emma asked, a flicker of concern rising. Mayor Thompson seemed confident the vote would go in my favor, despite Fletcher's objections. The mayor is likely correct, Robert assured her, but Fletcher rarely accepts defeat gracefully, especially in public matters. I'm concerned he might take more indirect approaches to expressing his displeasure. You think he would interfere with my teaching? Not openly, but Pinecrest, for all its growth, remains a small community where influence operates in subtle ways. Parents might be discouraged from sending their children to school, or resources you request might be mysteriously delayed. Emma considered these possibilities with growing determination rather than discouragement. Then I'll need to demonstrate my value so clearly that such tactics become obviously spiteful rather than effective. A smile warmed Robert's usually serious features. That's precisely what I expected you'd say. He leaned forward slightly, his expression intent. Emma, I want you to know that whatever develops between us personally, my support for your position as teacher is unconditional. The town needs you, regardless of Fletcher's wounded pride or Mrs. Reed's shallow judgments. Thank you, she said, touched by his declaration, though I admit I'm more interested in what might develop between us personally than in professional support, valuable as that is. The directness of her statement surprised them both, but Emma found she didn't regret it. Life had taught her the value of honest communication, especially when future possibilities remained uncertain. Robert's expression softened further, the guardedness that typically characterized his demeanor giving way to something more vulnerable. I've been alone since returning from the war, he said quietly. At first, because healing required all my attention, then because purpose seemed sufficient company. I didn't expect to find someone who would make me question that sufficiency. Yet here we are, Emma observed. Here we are, he echoed. After a moment's hesitation, he extended his hand across the space between them, palm up, an invitation, rather than presumption. Emma placed her hand in his without hesitation, the simple contact conveying more than words could express. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and strong, the calluses from years of work creating a texture that spoke of capability and purpose. They sat like that for several heartbeats, connected by touch and understanding in the quiet Sunday afternoon light. No declarations were made, no promises exchanged beyond the implicit recognition that whatever path lay ahead, they would explore it with mutual respect and honesty. "I should go," Robert said eventually, though he made no immediate move to release her hand. Deputy Parker can only maintain order for so long without supervision, and Sunday afternoons often bring minors to town looking for entertainment. "Of course," Emma agreed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. "Your duties take precedence." They stood together, the moment shifting from intimate to proper once more, though something fundamental had changed between them. At the door, Robert paused, his expression thoughtful. "Would you allow me to escort you to the school board meeting tomorrow evening? It might be helpful to have support, given Fletcher's likely opposition." Emma considered the offer and its implications. Arriving together would signal a connection between them to the community, potentially complicating her professional standing before it was even established. Yet the thought of facing Fletcher's disapproval alone held little appeal. "Yes," she decided, "I would appreciate your company." His smile, rare but transformative when it appeared, warmed her more than the afternoon sunlight. "Until tomorrow, then. 6 o'clock?" "6 o'clock," she confirmed. Monday morning dawned clear and promising, a perfect day for new beginnings. Emma packed her belongings efficiently, her trunks and carpet bags representing the sum of her worldly possessions, yet containing everything necessary for her fresh start. Clara helped arrange transportation to the teacher's cottage, and as Jensen offered his wagon after completing his morning smithing work. "The whole town's talking about your confrontation with Fletcher after church," the blacksmith informed her as they loaded her trunks. "Most folks are on your side, especially the mothers. They care more about their children learning proper sums than about a teacher's appearance." "I'm grateful for their support," Emma said sincerely. "I intend to earn their trust through results rather than words." The teacher's cottage welcomed her with sunlight streaming through freshly washed windows and a small vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table. Elizabeth Thompson's thoughtful touch. Mayor Thompson arrived shortly after Emma had begun unpacking, bringing the school keys and final instructions. "The children have been notified that classes resume Wednesday," he explained, handing her a leather-bound register. 26 currently enrolled, though attendance has been inconsistent without a permanent teacher. This lists their names, ages, and general academic standing according to Mrs. Whitaker's assessment. Emma accepted the register gratefully. "This will be immensely helpful for planning. Please thank Mrs. Thompson for the flowers as well. They make the cottage feel like home already." The mayor beamed with evident pleasure at her appreciation. Elizabeth believes in welcoming newcomers properly. She's organized a small gathering of parents tonight after the board meeting, assuming all goes well, which I'm certain it will. Even with Mr. Fletcher's opposition. "Especially with his opposition," the mayor replied with surprising frankness. "Harold's influence has dominated town decisions for too long. Many on the council are ready for more balanced perspectives, though few have been willing to challenge him directly, as you did yesterday." Emma spent the remainder of the day organizing the cottage and reviewing curriculum materials left by previous teachers. The small home quickly took on her personality. Books arranged on shelves, personal mementos displayed on the mantel, her mother's quilt spread across the narrow bed. By late afternoon, she felt settled enough to visit the schoolhouse itself, using the keys Mayor Thompson had provided. The single-room schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and pine floors, sunlight slanting through the west-facing windows to illuminate rows of desks arranged by size, smallest at the front for the youngest students, larger ones at the back for teenagers. The teacher's desk stood on a slightly raised platform, modest but possessing quiet authority in its position facing the room. Emma moved through the space, familiarizing herself with the available materials, surprisingly well supplied for a frontier school, with maps, readers, slates, and even a small collection of science specimens in a glass-fronted cabinet. She was making notes about necessary arrangements when she heard the schoolhouse door open behind her. Tommy Fletcher stood in the doorway, uncertainty written across his features as he realized the building wasn't empty. "Sorry, Miss Sullivan. I didn't know anybody was here." "It's all right, Tommy," she assured him. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" "Today, classes don't resume until Wednesday." The boy shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "I left something here before Mrs. Thompson stopped teaching." He gestured vaguely toward the back row of desks. "A book. It was my pa's." Emma nodded understanding. "Would you like to look for it now?" Tommy hesitated, then crossed to the largest desk at the back corner, reaching underneath to remove a slim volume wedged into a crack between the desktop and frame. He held it carefully, almost reverently. A worn copy of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. "Uncle Harold says novels are a waste of time," he explained without being asked. "Says I should focus on practical learning since I'll be taking over the lumber business someday. But Pa used to read this to me at night. Said imagination was just as important as facts." The simple statement revealed volumes about the conflict between Tommy's heritage and his uncle's expectations. Emma felt her heart soften toward the boy, recognizing in his defiance not mere disobedience, but a desperate attempt to maintain connection with his lost parents. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said gently. "Different kinds of knowledge serve different purposes. Practical skills help us survive, but stories help us understand why survival matters." Tommy looked up sharply, surprise evident in his expression. "That's almost exactly what Pa used to say." "Then we would have agreed on educational philosophy," Emma smiled. "Perhaps you could bring that book on Wednesday. We might find time for reading after arithmetic lessons are complete." A tentative smile transformed the boy's usually guarded features. "Really? Uncle Harold told me the new teacher would be strict about proper subjects only." "Learning takes many forms, Tommy. I believe in educational balance. Practical skills and imaginative exploration both have their place." She gestured toward the book he still clutched protectively. "That can be our secret curriculum if you'd prefer your uncle not know about it." The offer of complicity created an immediate bond between them. Tommy nodded, carefully tucking the book inside his jacket. "I should go. Uncle Harold thinks I'm delivering a message to Mr. Simmons at the bank." "We wouldn't want to make you late then," Emma agreed, understanding the importance of not creating additional friction between uncle and nephew. "I'll see you Wednesday morning, 8 o'clock sharp." After Tommy departed, Emma continued her preparations with renewed purpose. The brief encounter had reinforced her conviction that accepting the teaching position was the right decision, not merely for her own future, but for children like Tommy who needed guidance that extended beyond rigid academic instruction. As evening approached, she changed into her best dress, not Clara's borrowed green, but her own navy blue with its modest lace trim, and arranged her hair simply but neatly. The school board meeting would be her first official introduction to the community in her new role, and while she wouldn't conceal her scarring, she intended to present herself with quiet dignity. Precisely at 6 o'clock, a knock at the cottage door announced Robert's arrival. When she opened it, she found him dressed in his formal attire from the Sunday social, his badge polished and his expression conveying both admiration and respect as he took in her appearance. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his arm. "Ready to make history in Pinecrest?" Emma smiled, feeling a confidence that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with purpose. "History might be an overstatement, but I'm certainly ready to begin this new chapter." "Be," As they walked arm in arm toward the town hall, where the board meeting would be held, Emma reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. She had come to Wyoming Territory, expecting to become Harold Fletcher's mail order bride, arriving with hope and leaving the station with rejection. Yet that very rejection had opened an unexpected door to independence, to meaningful work, and to a connection with a man who saw her scars as evidence of courage rather than reasons for rejection. Fletcher would attend the meeting, of course, and undoubtedly oppose her appointment with whatever influence he could muster. Victoria Reed and her allies would continue their shallow judgments and petty exclusions. There would be challenges in the classroom, in the community, perhaps even in whatever relationship might develop between herself and Robert. But as they approached the town hall, where lamps already glowed in the gathering dusk and the buzz of conversations could be heard through open windows, Emma felt not apprehension, but anticipation. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through fire to save her nephews, through rejection to find new purpose, through judgment to discover true acceptance. Beside her, Robert's steady presence offered support without diminishing her independence. Ahead of them, Pinecrest spread out with all its complexities and possibilities, a community in need of exactly what she could offer. "Shall we?" Robert asked as they reached the town hall steps. Emma nodded, squeezing his arm gently before releasing it to climb the stairs. "We shall." Together, they entered to face whatever the future held, not as mail-order bride and reluctant groom, but as teacher and marshal, equals united by mutual respect and growing affection. The scars they both carried, visible and invisible, had not defined their limitations but revealed their capacity for courage, a truth that no rejection could diminish and no judgment could deny. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.